Hello, welcome to this week's episode of FireDEV, a fireside chat with people in the industry. Today, my special guest is Chris Zimmerman of Sucker Punch, a co-founder of Sucker Punch. Chris, how are you doing?
I'm great today, Farhan. How are you?
I'm good. What's the weather like where you are? Probably better than where it is where I am.
It's April in Seattle, Farhan. That means it's overcast.
Yeah, it's not the best here. I mean, it's a bit better today compared to how it was a few days ago, but even here, considering we're at roughly mid-April, you would hope that we would be getting, close to summer weather. But in the U, have you ever been to the UK?
I have a few times, and
Yeah,
it can be a little bit Seattle-like.
yeah. So I'm guessing it wasn't a shock for you when you came over then, because I know I've heard
No,
people that come from another country, especially maybe certain parts of America or maybe over in the east where it's a bit warmer, and they're
yeah,
like, "What is this?" Especially the up and down nature of it.
yeah. And the other thing that I think is interesting is that if you're in Seattle in the spring or in the UK when I was there when I've been there in the summer, it has the same sort of feel after it rains. Everything feels very crystal clear and clean,
Mm,
and
mm.
so it was reminiscent of Seattle in that way.
Oh yeah, I mean, again, I've never been over to Seattle, or, Seattle, or to America, for that matter. But I can imagine that there are other places, like the UK. It does feel like UK is the only one that ever has this up and down. It's either here it's always sunny or it's always raining, and then in the UK it's like it can't make its mind up. Regardless. So yeah, you worked at before we even talk about Sucker Punch, you worked at Microsoft for a decade. What was
Yep.
your role there, and what was it like being part of that behemoth of a machine that is Microsoft?
Well, I think the interesting thing was that when I started, it wasn't a behemoth. There were maybe 2,500 people at Microsoft when I started.
I
It
mean,
was actually not
500
even,
is no small company.
yeah, it was still not a small company, but not what it grew into. It was, I think when I started, it was the fourth largest PC software company. So nothing like what it turned into. That all kind of happened, or most of that kind of happened while I was there. I joined in 1988, right after college. And I stayed until we started Sucker Punch in 1997. So, um, well, when I started in 1988, I was just out of school, and so I was kind of a junior programmer on the team. But I worked initially on in a group called Work Group Applications. This is so long ago that no one knew what email was. It wasn't clear what we were going to call it, but it was the team that eventually built Microsoft's email solutions, which are now Exchange and Outlook. Um, uh, and I was there at a time when Microsoft was growing explosively. We went from maybe 2,500 people when I started to about 25,000 when I left 9 years later. And then if you're working at a place like that where things are growing so explosively, there's a lot of room for there's a need really for people to step up and be given more responsibility than they've earned. And
Mhm.
that was sort of my career early on, being given more responsibility than I really should have been given. Running teams, being the lead architect on projects, helping start new projects, and that sort of continued for the 9 years I was at Microsoft. A lot of programming, but then also a lot of team management.
Okay. And whilst you're there, actually, before we even talk about that, y- how did you go about, getting that role? Was it the typical sort of you applied for, and like where did you see it? Because obviously nowadays in 2024, you go on a job website, you go on LinkedIn, it's a lot easier to see the jobs that are available. I can
Right.
imagine back then it probably wasn't that accessible in terms of seeing
Oh
what
no,
jobs are available. And
not
also,
at
how
all.
hard was it to get into Microsoft back then?
Um, it kind of depended. I was lucky. I went to sort of a fancy university here in the U.S., and Microsoft had a recruiting presence on campus. So they came, like many companies did, and interviewed students on campus. So I just signed up for an on campus interview and did well enough on it that they decided to fly me out to Seattle for a whole day of kind of long form interviews. So it wasn't hard. I didn't really know what I was going to work on. That wasn't part of the deal. You were just kind of on their college recruiting pipeline.
Yeah.
So while I was on campus at Microsoft, we did explore that a little bit more. And in fact, the role that they'd originally expected I was going to be taking if I joined, which was in kind of a distributed networking group, the LAN manager group at that time at Microsoft, ended up not actually matching my interests. I really wanted to work on applications. So there was a late pivot in the day, and I ended up spending a couple interviews at the end of the day talking to people that were in Microsoft's applications group. It just wasn't, there was no way for them to know this, right? This was so long ago that you didn't really have an online presence. It wasn't like they could look at LinkedIn or at my GitHub, trace to see what I'd done. All they had was on my resume. And that kind of seemed like I was going to be doing distributed systems, but it turns out that I'd actually be doing application stuff kind of in my spare time for fun. So that was really more where my heart lay.
Okay, fair enough.
But
And
very, very, very different. Let me tell you how different it was. This was, 35 years ago. So no one has email. This is way before there's texting and cell phones. So there's no way to get in touch with someone. The way that you get in touch with someone is by sending them a letter or maybe making a phone call. But you don't have a cell phone, so they just call the phone in the building I was living in, and someone has to yell, "Chris, the phone's for you," and I have to run downstairs and answer the phone. So when they actually tell me that they're flying me out, they sent this thing. I don't even remember what it was called. It was this crazy thing where you would call like a Western Union office, and they would like print out a piece of paper and bring it to your address. This was the way you got messages to someone quickly. It was so crazy that that's the way things worked at that point. So I got a little, typed up letter that had been sent from somewhere else in New Jersey that showed up on my doorstep, and that's how I found out that I was flying out to Seattle for interviews at Microsoft.
okay, I mean that again, that's a, a little bit before my time. So explore that a little bit because now if I get an email and this I don't know the person or there's something
Yeah,
like we're gonna do this for you, it feels like a scam. It's a some sort
yeah.
of some sort of con artist. Like, was there that feeling back then with this
No.
kind of messages, and how do you kind of decipher what's real and what's not real?
There wasn't any because no one had email, so there was no spam. So all of that sort of, uh, you know,
You
has
have
gone
those
through.
messages, that you're getting like via Western Union when you just get somebody randomly come up with a
Oh,
message
well,
saying we're going to fly you over.
I
Have
mean,
you?
I knew to expect it, right? I'd interviewed. If it had just come out of the blue, if I'd gotten a letter like that that purported to tell me to go to the airport, I would not have believed it. But in this case, I knew it was coming, so that wasn't as much of a surprise.
Were those sort of messages commonly used, or were they too expensive and only used in?
I have no idea. I got one or two of them when I was interviewing with colleges because it turned out to be a way for people on the West Coast to get quickly in touch with me. I was on the East Coast of the U.S. But no, this is not a common thing. It was just this crazy thing that happened during recruiting. I certainly never sent one.
So yeah, obviously started working on the email stuff and all that communication side, and I guess you never needed to. You could just send an email instead.
Well, yeah, I mean, we clearly we had email when I was in college. It wasn't like this hadn't been invented. We did have email. No one used it for anything except maybe handing in classwork, but it did exist. But it was not a common thing. Like if you stopped someone on the street and said electronic mail, they had no idea what you were talking about. It was new. It wasn't brand new, but it was new to the sort of public consciousness. It wasn't something that people knew about.
Well, what's funny is you just said that back then, if you stopped somebody and you asked them about electronic mail, they wouldn't know.
Yeah,
I bet you, if you stopped a youngster today, a kid
yeah,
today,
you're right.
they probably wouldn't know either because they don't know he has that. They know he has
Yeah,
email.
you're right. We've come full circle. Now we're back to nobody knowing what electronic mail is again.
Yeah, even though everyone uses it and everyone
Yeah,
knows.
exactly.
Yeah, so yeah, that's a pretty weird one. So, what was email like when you was at university and using it? Was it you could send it to anyone, or was it like restricted within certain sort of university campuses or like organizations?
Well, it was the internet mail protocols that we know now. I mean, it really wasn't any different, other than that the email clients you were using were, gosh, I feel like I know that most of the people that are listening to this will have a hard time imagining this, but this was These were command line interfaces to look at mail. Written to run on teletypes effectively. So not even a full screen text mode email program, but an email program where you got a command prompt and you'd say, show me the next 10 lines, and it would show you the next 10 lines. So that's what it was like when I was at university. Now, when I was at Microsoft, we were, doing Macintosh or Windows interfaces to things. So that was really more what you would expect now. And in fact, if you ran the first email client that team built, it would feel very familiar to you, to email clients today. A list of folders on the left, list of messages on the right. You wouldn't have any problems figuring out how to do things, which is kind of interesting. That's true, I suppose, for a lot of software. Like if you use a word processor today, a GUI word processor doesn't feel fundamentally different than the first GUI word processors from, all those many years ago.
Oh yeah, I think that's interesting. So, why do you think that is? Do you think they haven't fundamentally changed that much? Whether it's some sort of email protocol, email application, or a word processor, because they was already so good in the one that got established, or they just kind of haven't
Yeah, that's a good
reinvented it.
question. Yeah, I don't know whether it was that there was an obvious kind of way for them to work. It wasn't true early on. Like the very, very first email clients didn't work that way. But they quickly settled on the form that they have now. Word processors the same way. It's hard to say. Was it possible that there was another kind of form that they could have taken? Now they all work the same because they all work the same, right? You use them, everyone expects them to work the way they work. And so it's really hard to change, right? You get into a kind of a potential energy well, right? Where you can't make small changes because it's outweighed by people's need for the familiar in the interface. So once there is sort of an expected form for things, things tend not to change very much. And that's true no matter what kind of design or what kind of UX you're building. So I don't know. Like in some ways it's interesting, right? Because at its fundamental design, Google Mail has a very different design in that it's just fundamentally search based. And yet the interface that you use for it is still, or it can be, a more traditional foldering model, even though it's not really a foldering system in any way underneath the hood.
More like tags, and you
Yeah,
sometimes
exactly.
feel that when you are using the search, like
Yeah,
certain things that I'm sure you've experienced, there's certain things that you think would get the list of emails that you want, out of it. You type it in, and it just doesn't bring it up, and you think this is obviously should bring it up. But then sometimes
yeah,
when you type in something that shouldn't bring it up, brings it
yeah.
up. And it's like, how is this even like working? And you're right, it isn't. They've kind of added that sort of GUI to make it familiar, but then there is that difference
Yeah.
fundamentally.
It's kind of an interesting maybe argument for the power of the paradigm of folders and email, that even though that's not the way the system works, and in fact it's awkwardly a mismatch, they still feel like they need to provide that interface for people.
Oh yeah, and so what's your go-to, mail client? Actually, at Sucker Punch, or what do you guys use? Do you
We
use
use
something like Google or
we use
Microsoft?
Outlook. We use Outlook in the Microsoft suite. Not because it's necessarily the best. I don't think I'm in a position to say what's good and what's bad in the email client space these days, but because it's easier to administer. That's the thing about a lot of the decisions that we would make at a sort of a corporate level in terms of what our IT infrastructure is going to be. It's not just about what the best user experience is going to be, especially if there's not a lot to differentiate options. It's more about what's efficient and secure for us to run.
Yeah,
And so our IT staff, at the point where we used to run on kind of open source stuff for a
yeah,
long, long time. And then we switched as part of kind of a professionalization of our IT staff to something that the IT staff was more comfortable running and administering. And so we've been in an Outlook and Exchange studio now for, oh gosh, I don't know, 15, 20 years.
yeah. I'm guessing it's also about making sure it's up and running as much as possible and requires
Yeah,
the least amount of maintenance. Because, like, if you send somebody an email, you don't want to think, is it even going to get to him, or is his application even going to
yeah.
work on his computer?
Well,
You want to know it's
yeah,
running.
and I think that, and it's like you only have one set of user accounts to manage, one set of user groups to manage, and so on. So there are advantages to having an integrated solution.
Yeah. So are you using the rest of the, the Microsoft, 365 suite as well, along with Outlook?
I suppose we do, yeah. I mean, it's a mix. It's a mix depending on who we're working with, but we do use Teams internally, and yeah, we most people. Again, it depends on what you're doing and who you're talking to. But I use the Microsoft apps when I need to, write a document or build a spreadsheet. But we certainly have people that are using the Google apps for the same things.
Okay. So back in the 80s, you studied at Princeton. You
Yep.
studied computer science, and it's one of the top universities, not only in USA, but it's also one of the top universities in the world as well. What was computer science like then? Like, what was the state of it? How many people was even on the course? Like nowadays,
Yeah.
it's one of the most popular courses around everywhere.
It is. Yeah, it's crazy. I think there were maybe 10 people that got a degree in computer science when I graduated. And that's the university has, I think when I was there, maybe a little over 1,000 people per class. So about 1% of them were computer science majors. And as you say, Princeton's no different than most universities. I think this year it's over 30% of people are computer science majors.
Yeah.
Some completely and utterly ridiculous number. That can't be right. I think someone told me that, but I almost don't believe it. So it's crazy, though. I mean, it was again. Once again, I will tell an anecdote, which makes it seem like I'm very old because I am. Um, the year I graduated was the first year you were actually allowed to have a degree in computer science. Before my year, you could get a degree, but it was in electrical engineering / computer science. So you had to do both of them. And my year was the first year you could actually study computer science itself. In terms of the actual study of computer science, the things that were true then are true now. The programming then, if you're using an imperative language, whether that's C++ like we use at Sucker Punch, or Go or Python or whatever, the process of programming hasn't fundamentally changed that much. It was before the object-oriented revolution, really, when I started. And again, many of your listeners will be too young to remember this was even, there was a time before that, but that idea came into being during my early professional career, or while I was in college, although I wasn't really aware of it at the time. And then when we started building software, that was kind of the advent of C++ and the other early object-oriented languages. So that was maybe the biggest difference between what I do now and what I did when I was in college, was that it's in C++ rather than C. And so that changes how you think about problems. So, or enables you to do a style of programming that you could do in C, but was a little bit awkward.
Yeah. Plus, I mean, I find it interesting that you did C++ when you were at university. That's literally what I did when I was at university from
Yeah,
2010 to 2014. Obviously,
yeah,
things have changed. The development environments have changed. The systems have changed. The features. But saying that, we were still using a relatively old version of C, or C. Like, I'd say for C, probably vanilla C as you could guess. So
yeah,
didn't have any new features. C++, for the most part, apart from like a couple of modules where we there was using some more STL stuff. For the most part, it was pretty vanilla C++ as well. But so it's
yeah.
crazy to think that 20 years later, I was still just using the same
Mm.
language as you.
Yeah, it's crazy that things haven't changed so much. Again, same sort of thing we were talking about with UXs earlier. I mean, there are languages that I think are objectively better than C++ at this point,
Yeah.
but they're not so much better that it's worth the cost of switching, and moving away from all the things that are already available in C++ or are already convenient in C++.
Yeah. Plus, it depends on what you're trying to achieve. Because you studied computer science, I studied computer games programming. So it's
Yeah,
more of a focus on games. And you're in the gaming industry, if you really want to do stuff with hardcore games, AAA titles, you're gonna be doing probably some sort of C++ you work, no matter how much Python is taking over universities and colleges for education. It's still not the go-to game language for making AAA $100 million budget games. It is still something probably like C++, and maybe even C if you're trying to go low level and do some sort of custom engine work. So I think there's an element of that, the fact that I was doing it in games, because regular computer science now a lot of that is Python and some like JavaScript as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. And we do that at Sucker Punch as well. We do a lot of programming in C++, but then we have we also use Python for a lot of things, just not running in the game. And then we have an in-house scripting language that's similar in a lot of ways to Python, that we use that actually does run in game. So we do use a mix of sort of compiled, performance-oriented languages, along with more convenient to use scripting languages running in our game.
Okay. And for like C++ and Python, for C++, when you're making the games, is it predominantly C++, or do you mix some other languages in, for runtime? Because like you said, Python is,
Yeah,
other stuff.
it is. We do. It's about maybe I do know the numbers. Uh, I let's see. Last time I checked when we did the book to find out what the mix was, and it was we had maybe 60% of our code was C++, and 30 to 40% was in our own in-house scripting languages. So it's a mix. Kind of depends on what you're doing. Like the stuff that's actually pushing the triangles around, rendering stuff on screen, or the physics engine, all that's written in C++. The thing we do with our scripting language is a lot of the stuff that's closer to the user experience. So if we have some mini game in Ghost of Tsushima, that's most likely implemented entirely in our scripting language. So that's kind of how the split usually works out. Or if we have some custom little bit of code to do something particular in a mission in the game, that sort of thing will be written in our scripting language rather than in C++. And then the scripting language, a big difference for us. The scripting language obviously is more approachable. We have more people at the company that can build it, can write stuff in it. The thing that's interesting about it then is that it is attached to the content. So instead of being compiled into our engine, into the executable, it's actually attached to the content. So when you have a mission that loads, it has script associated with it. That script is loaded with the mission. It's not sort of statically bound into the game.
Okay, so is it like the difference of compiled versus interpreted? Is it more of an interpreted?
Yeah,
Sort of
it compiles to a P code, so it compiles down to a byte code that we have an interpreter to run. So it's not strictly speaking interpreted; it is compiled, but it's not compiled to machine language. It's compiled to an intermediate form that gets executed. So, like in the general rule of thumb for stuff like that, and our language is no different, is that it's about a factor of 10 typically. So if you go from C++ code to Python, it's going to slow down. Depending on what you're doing, it'll slow down by a factor of 10 or so. And that may seem like a lot, but for a lot of the things we're doing, it's completely fine to run 10 times slower. It's not important. Even running 10 times slower, it's still 1% of our frame. So it's fine. It's fine for it to run slow. It doesn't matter. That said, we do end up using our scripting language for a lot of stuff. And sometimes those things end up being costly or costly enough for us to convert them into C++. So an example from Ghost of Tsushima is that originally all of what we call internally personas, which is the code that determines how someone fights, what attacks they use in melee combat, and when they move and where they go and all that stuff. That was all originally written in Splice, which is our in-house scripting language. And there was a lot of it, and it was running for a lot of characters. And that did get to the point where it was chewing up like 5% of a frame for us. So that we rewrote in C++ during kind of the end stretch on Ghost of Tsushima.
Okay, so this in-house scripting language, Splice. How long ago did you guys make it? What was the first game that it was made for? And what's the process of making your own language?
Oh, it's fun. There's a great book. If any of your listeners are interested, there's a great book called, I think it's called Crafting Interpreters. If it's not, I'll get you the real name. That basically walks you through the steps of building an interpreter from scratch, like really from scratch, just writing in C. And it's a great book, super fun to read. Actually, walks you all the way through. Um, so the decision, though, to do it was kind of an interesting one. Our first game was a Nintendo 64 game called Rocket Robot on Wheels, and that was done entirely in C. And even the things that we would now do in scripting were done in C. So anytime you needed to change anything, you needed to recompile the engine. And that obviously was a little bit slower than we'd like. So when we were working on the first Sly Cooper game, Sly Cooper and the Thievius Raccoonus, we decided we wanted to have a scripting language in the game. And there was an obvious alternative, which was to use Python at that point. But we kind of played around with it and did some experiments, and it seemed like it wasn't a good fit for us. Python was written for bigger computers than a PlayStation 2. And so it was a little bit of a memory hog by our standards, meaning it took like a half a megabyte of memory, which now seems crazy that you would worry about that. But, we were building for a system where we had maybe 6 megs of memory to play with. So taking out a half meg for our scripting language didn't seem like a great idea. So we decided to roll our own scripting language, and we actually chose to do the scripting language that is the easiest possible language to write a compiler or interpreter for, which is Lisp. So that's what we did. We wrote a Lisp interpreter, more specifically a Scheme interpreter, which is kind of a variant of Lisp. So we compiled Scheme, and that's what we ran in the engine. And we did a whole project with that, just having a compiler. And being geniuses at software development, didn't realize until we were done with that having a compiler with no debugger is really not going to be a lot of fun. So when we wrote our second Sly Cooper game, Sly Cooper 2, we built a full development environment for our scripting language. So since then we've had all the things you would expect in a debugger, and watch windows and breakpoints and everything you would expect.
So, when you're working on these sort of projects, what I find, especially with developers, they can be a bit stuck in the ways of this is better than this is better than this, especially when it's I find on a lower level. Like, how much pushback was there internally for let's stick with the C++ C, so the more hardcore stuff we know that works. Why are we making a scripting language? We don't need to. We got C++.
Yeah. It's a great question, Farhan. I in these particular cases, there was not a lot of dissent because it was so obvious that what we were doing was ridiculously stupid. But you can't change your mind mid-project very easily. Once you're on track and getting the game done, you just have to buckle down and get the game done. There's a time and a place for making big changes in the way that you're developing the game, and 6 months from ship is not the time or the place. But that does mean that once the game's out, you're like, oh my gosh, let's never do that again. And so some of these decisions are pretty easy to make when it's super obvious to everybody that what you're doing is really bad. Sometimes we get into situations where it's obvious that things are wrong, but it's not obvious what to do about them. And so those are a little bit trickier to manage. And because you can't do both approaches, right? So when we were working on Infamous Second Son, which came out in 2014, I think, we had done a game. This is the third Infamous game. Infamous games are superhero games, so you've got superpowers, and clearly they're effects heavy, VFX heavy. And we'd done that with kind of a relatively low budget, low ambition effects engine in the first two Infamous games, and we felt like that was a mistake, especially as we were moving to the PlayStation 4 generation. We knew there was going to be a lot more bandwidth available if we could figure out how to leverage the GPU with our new effects engine. Um, and so there's this kind of obvious problem that we wanted to build a GPU friendly VFX engine, but it wasn't clear how to build it. It wasn't clear what the authoring paradigm should be. And we had discussions about it. And in the end, what we did was the decision was made by Fiat. I basically said, here's what we're going to do. And there was some grumbling, but we went ahead and did it. And what we ended up doing in that case was um, not what most people do. So, most people, if they're building kind of a technical artist friendly system for building VFX, they tend to end up in spaghetti graph land, where you're visually creating, doing visual programming. You're creating nodes and drawing lines between them. So a node for bitmap and a node for a function and all these things, and you end up with this tangle of a dozen or so nodes and arrows that end up creating some visual effect. What we did instead was very similar in terms of its expressibility, but expressed very differently. We took a spreadsheet inspired approach, which may seem crazy, but an approach where our VFX artists were writing kind of spreadsheet style expressions for things, expressing the same things, like, oh, here's a fall off function over time, or here's where you want to get this data from. But they were doing it kind of with formulas rather than in creating nodes and drawing lines between them. And it wasn't obvious that this was going to work. There certainly was a lot of question about whether this made any sense at all. But it did end up working really well for us. Our VFX artists are smart cookies, and they figured out how to use it. And we were able to do some, really nice looking VFX in Second Son, and it's still the core approach that we use for VFX now in games like Ghost. So there, you had this sort of clear problem, and a decision was made by Fiat. Sometimes it's hard to have any sort of democratic process for problems like that. And then sometimes we have decisions where there isn't a clear there isn't even a clear problem, just a little bit of annoyance. Every project at SEC, we have a very one of the things about running a medium-sized development team, we have 35 coders on the team right now out of 160 or 170 people at Sucker Punch. If you're going to have 35 programmers, in our experience, you really want to have a pretty clean and clearly defined set of conventions about how we're all going to work together. So for us, that means we have very clear ideas about how things should be named, or how code should be distributed over source files, or how things should work together. We have a clear set of rules about those things. And we actually have a team vote every project. We once a project cycle. So after Ghost of Tsushima was all done, the development team identified the coding team identified all the things that might change in the standards. There was some online debate about what should change, and then there was just a big vote, and we just we had pure democracy. The new rules were a result of exactly the team vote, and we went through all the code and changed it all to match the new conventions, and then we were happy and ready to go for another project cycle. So it kind of depends. This is a very, very long answer to your question, but it kind of depends. Sometimes you have a big problem that's obvious, and everyone agrees. Sometimes you have a big problem and there's no obvious solution, and we often just choose a direction and head down that way. And sometimes there's not even an obvious problem, and in some cases we'll actually even just do a vote, which would have horrified me at 22. At 22, I would have been so convinced that there was a right answer, and then we just needed to talk about it. We could figure out what the right answer was. 58-year-old me, it's like, yeah, some questions, it doesn't really matter where you put the curly brace. It just matters that you're all putting it in the same space.
Yeah, you're focusing on it. You all unified on that decision now, even if it was not your idea.
Yeah.
I think
And
that's important, that everyone running in their own direction, but convinced they've got the magic pill.
Yeah, it doesn't work so well. And I don't know. We've all worked on teams where there was somebody who thought they had the magic answer, right? And they're off running in their own direction. And that's rarely pleasant. Even if you're the person that's doing that, it's rarely pleasant. And we try to not have that happen here at Sucker Punch. And part of that is, um, part of the recruiting process. When we're interviewing people that want to join the team, we do try to look for how that fit's going to work. Is this someone that really is going to be energized by being part of a team of, high functioning coworkers? Or is this someone that really would be happier working on their own? That's the source of their thrill, right? Is doing something by themselves. People where that's their core motivation, where they are grudgingly working on a team because that's where the jobs are, but they'd rather be working on their own. They tend not to flourish at Sucker Punch. So it's something that we do try to keep an eye out for during the interview process, because we really work as a very collaborative team, where it's building a game is a we thing, not a me thing. um, and we look for recruiting, and if we find people who seem like they're not fitting, we have to have a hard conversation with them about whether Sucker Punch is the right spot for them or not. At the same time, we've done a good job of hiring people here, and so the team is very strong, full of people that are going to be a star wherever they go. And for a lot of people here, that is the best part about working at Sucker Punch, is that they're working with a team where they have to actually work hard to keep up. If you're someone who has been, the smartest cookie in every room you've been in, for some people that is the thrill. They want that, and they shouldn't come work here. But for a lot of people, just being in a team where everybody that's working is as good at, or better at what they're doing as you, is energizing, right? You're just like, you don't have to slow down to have any conversations, right? Everyone's running at your speed, and that's a great environment to work in. So that then, I think, creates social pressure that helps keep our coding culture sane, and not having everyone kind of squirrel off in different directions. There is a sort of social pressure that being in a team full of smart people, that people are not as likely to think that they alone have the true source of wisdom about how programming should be done.
Okay, so for anyone that's listening, that's head of hiring, or hires people on a regular basis, what are the things that you recommend looking out for to see if they are going to be a good fit, if they're
Yeah,
are going to be like team players and not, like you said, lone wolves?
I think that it really depends on your culture. It's a hard question for me to answer in the abstract. I mean, I can answer what we look for, but I couldn't, I think, credibly answer what someone else would look for without knowing more about their corporate culture, right? I mean,
What would the punch look for then?
we look for the things we look for when we're looking, especially at junior people. And that's one of the things that's different about our hiring process compared to many games companies, is that we're perfectly happy to hire people without games industry experience, whether that means that they're just out of school, or whether that means they're making a career change, right? They're shifting lanes, they've worked on something different, now they want to work on games. A lot of companies have decided, for their own reasons, that they want to have games industry experience. And for us, that's been fine. If someone comes to us having worked elsewhere in games, it's perfectly fine. But most of our staff have actually come to us without any games industry background, because in our experience, it's easy to teach people what they need to know about games. And by removing that constraint, we open ourselves up to a much larger talent pool. The set of people that would like to work in games and are, sharp enough to keep up with the pack here at Sucker Punch, it's easier to find people if you're not, putting an extra constraint on them that they must have shipped a AAA action game. We're confident, especially given our history of hiring people like that and having them turn into key contributors, we're confident in our ability to identify the things that are going to make people successful here, and to train them in the things that they don't know to start with. So what do we look for? We look for people that, I feel like I'm going to hand away the store here, that everyone's going to know what the answer to my question. So next time I ask them to someone interviewing here, but I'm going to do it anyhow. Uh, we look for people that will take ownership of their own mistakes. So one of the things that is true of our approach to making games in general, and this is true for the coding team and for the other parts of Sucker Punch, is that we give people a lot of autonomy to make their own decisions. There's not much micromanaging here. The managers are typically have their own work to do, and they're kind of keeping an eye on their reports as kind of a side job. And that means that they have to give people autonomy because they're not looking over their shoulder every day. And that sort of autonomy only works if people are able to recognize that they've made a mistake, and to back up and fix it. And so that's one of the things that we look for in all our interview loops, is the ability to recognize that you've made a mistake, own it, and go fix it. And that is hard to look for in an interview, because people tend to treat the question of, if I ask someone, what's the most painful mistake you've ever made, people tend to treat that as a trick question, that there's no good answer to it. So the answer should be something like, well, my mistake is I care too much. What are these stupid non-answer answers? When in fact, in that case, I'm really actually looking to see, do you know what your biggest mistake was? Because if you don't, you surely have made a big mistake, right? Nobody is perfect. We all make mistakes. Some people are better than others at recognizing that they've made a mistake. And it's those people, that skill of recognizing you've made a mistake, maybe with nobody pointing them out, just realizing that, oh, wait, now I'm thinking about it, I've done this, and now I see that this approach I took was the wrong approach to take. That is a skill, or a talent, and it's one that we do look for. And not being able to name a mistake you've made is an indicator that maybe Sucker Punch isn't the right fit for you. So that's something we look for. Something I look for in resumes when I look, especially at younger people that are new in their career, is people who've made things happen. And what I mean by that is that it's perfectly fine to have a CV that shows that you've been in some course of studying, you've done well at it. That's great. That's impressive. The thing that I particularly look for is people that have colored outside the lines, that have seen something they wanted to have happen that wasn't there, that they went and made it happen. That whether that's, oh, I started the computer game development club at my uni or whatever, right? That sort of thing, or I started this side business that I was running while I was in college. Those sorts of things, or I was interested in game development. There wasn't a course of study for me, so I just went ahead and built a game on my own. And here it is. You can look at it. It's on Steam. Those sorts of things are, I find very impressive, and I think it correlates well to success here at Sucker Punch. That is kind of the culture we have, is for everyone here to feel empowered to look at the things we're doing, and to say, yeah, this is okay, but it could be better. And I have an idea of how it could be better. And I'm just going to figure out a way to kind of, rubber band and chewing gum something together, that shows that there's a good solution here, to make it obvious to everyone that we need to change something about the game. That's the sort of thing that turns our games from being good to great. And so we count on everyone here to be looking for those opportunities.
So what's the, talking about, getting a job at Sucker Punch, what's the interview process like to get a job? Is it one stage, two stage? Is it like you have to go there in person, remote, technical, non-technical?
Yeah,
What's it like?
it depends on which job you're interviewing for, obviously. So our process, if you're coming here to be a QA person, is different than if you're here to do full-time programming. All of our interview processes, Where we can, we actually try to include a healthy amount of assessment. Assessment meaning that there's our tests of some sort that you're going to take, which are our attempt to measure your skill set. Um, for the programming, if you're applying for a programming job, there's a programming test that you do where there's some prompt, some problem that needs to be solved, some set of constraints, and we say off you go. Use the language of your choice, et cetera, et cetera. Here's how many hours we expect you to spend. And we expect people to go off and write a solution to this and then submit it. Uh, and that assessment model, and then so we have let's see, 3 stages really, I suppose, on the programming side. So typically the first stage is that if you're applying for a job, you'll say, I'd like to apply for a job, send in your CV, and unless there's a real non-fit, we do sometimes get resumes from people who just don't have the background to succeed here, and so they're going to get a polite decline at the beginning. But a lot of people are going to get the programming test as their next step to see how they do. And that's kind of an interesting step, right? It works really well for programming, at least from our standpoint, in that we can actually see, we're asking people to come in and be programmers. It's useful for us to see whether they can program. And looking at someone's resume is not always a good measure of that in our experience. So giving them a problem they haven't solved before and seeing if they can actually write a solution to it, figure out how they're going to solve it, and then actually solving it. It is a really useful measure. The people that do well on that test tend to do well in our interviews and then tend to do well at Sucker Punch. But it also is useful for other reasons. There is this sort of attitude, I think, a lot of people have, especially more senior experienced people, with assessment-based interview processes where they're being asked to solve a problem or asked to answer a question of, a sense of, well, why are you asking me to do this? This is beneath me. I shouldn't be asked to do this. I've been working in the industry for 10 years. I clearly can do this. And so people get upset. People will refuse to take the test. And that's actually I'm going to say something that is counterintuitive here, I think. That's actually okay with us. It's entirely possible that person is really skilled and that they would succeed here, but it's okay for them to turn this down because in return, what it means is that we get the sort of people making it through that stage of the process for whom that process is fun, that you're given a prompt, some set of constraints, and you're solving it by writing code. Gosh, that sounds like fun to me, and that's why I'm a programmer. So, I voluntarily do this thing called Advent of Code every year, which is exactly that, right? So, Advent of Code, during the month of December, every day you get a programming prompt and a problem to solve, and you write code to solve it, and do you know what you get for it? Guess what? Nothing. You get nothing except for the joy of solving the problem. So I do that every year. I think it's great. So that's what our programming assessment test is. It's exactly that. So, if someone feels like it's beneath them, they don't want to do this, it's like, well, okay, you're just probably not going to be a fit culturally because this is super fun to solve problems like that. In addition, it means that if someone's not up for solving this problem that they get, and it's a different problem depending on what sort of job they're interviewing, sort of programming job they're interviewing for, they're probably not going to enjoy working here. If they can't solve this problem, it is not at the tough end of difficulty for the problems they're going to solve. So, probably best for them to, sometimes people realize it themselves. They're like, okay, I suppose this isn't a great fit for me. Let me go find something that's a better fit for where I'm at in my career right now. So they do the assessment test that gets kind of graded by hand. We'll look at it and see how they do. And if they do well on it, then they'll get a phone screen. So they'll have an interview over Zoom typically, and they're going to do the same sort of thing. It's going to be a whiteboard programming problem. And this is something that our kind of focus on this really starts with Microsoft. We talked earlier about how that's where I spent the first part of my career. And that is the way that Microsoft did interviews, and it was very out of the ordinary at that point. I interviewed with a lot of companies when I was graduating from university, and Microsoft was the one that actually tested what I knew. A lot of the places I went, even big tech companies, were kind of looking at my resume and asking me questions about my resume, but it really wasn't. There was no structure to it. Microsoft absolutely had structure to it. They had the same sort of whiteboard problems that people still solve today when they're going and interviewing at Microsoft or Facebook or Google or whatever. Um, but Microsoft was relatively early on that way of doing interviews, and we, naturally ended up doing that at Sucker Punch as well. Um, so the stage after the take-home test is to basically do live programming on Zoom. So I don't remember what program we're using these days, but you're typically typing into a window where you can compile and execute code while someone is kind of half paying attention. So you're just doing it on the clock, and it's an easy problem that you're doing in that one. And then there's some chit chat talking about resume normal stuff. And then if you've done well there, then we'll actually do a full cycle where you're going to talk to, I don't know, 4 or 5 people here at Sucker Punch from different parts of the company, not all programmers. And we're kind of trying to get a holistic look at the strengths that you have, what you might bring to the team. And a lot of it is going to be more whiteboard problems, but not all of it. And at the end of it, then we are kind of looking at everyone's feedback to say, how did this person do? And we'll make a decision of whether they seem like a good fit for us or not. So it was a very, very long-winded discussion of what our interview process looks like. There's similarities if you look at what we're doing for other teams. There's almost always some amount of assessment that we do to make sure that you've got the skills to succeed here. And then a lot of cultural fit stuff too, to make sure that you're actually going to be happier. The thing about recruiting, I would say, from my point of view, is that it is, if you think about it, no matter how much work we put into it on our side and on the person who's interviewing side, it's a huge life decision for someone to make, right? To decide, okay, here's where I'm going to spend the next N years of my life. Our bar is 5 years. I mean, that's how long we think we want people to stay before it feels like a win. If someone says 5 years, we're like, okay, that was victory. That was someone we should have hired. If someone leaves after a year, well, it's like, well, that was kind of a miss. That was probably not the right person to. We shouldn't have said yes to them, or they shouldn't have said yes to us. One of those two, right? It's a big decision. You're going to spend years of your life working with these people, and yet we expect everyone to make this decision on almost no information, right? I mean, you've done some phone chat with someone. Maybe you know what games they make. Maybe you've done 4 hours of interviews, and at the end of that, they're going to make a decision, and you're going to make a decision as the interviewee. Do I want to spend the next 5 years of my life doing this? It's crazy, right? That you would make such a big decision based on so little information, and yet that's what we do. So a lot of our process is built around not just gathering the information that we need to be confident in that decision, that we can be confident that us saying yes is going to result in someone who's going to be a fit, but also making sure that the person who's interviewing gets enough information, right? Because it's got to work both ways. If this person's a good fit from our standpoint, they have the skills to succeed here, but they're not happy with the environment, then it's not going to work, right? So our to the extent that we can, we try to make sure that all of our interview processes are set up so that the person that's interviewing gets the information they need to make a good decision. That it's not just about Sucker Punch making a decision; it's also about the candidate making a decision. And we it's hard. It's hard to do a good job. We don't have a 100% success rate, but we do try really hard to do as good a job as we can.
So have you ever, been in a situation where, you've got someone working there, they're doing a good job, they're interacting well with their colleagues, you're happy with the work, but and they're staying as well, then they're not leaving, but you can just tell they're not happy. Like you could tell that
Yeah,
they didn't for them, but they're performing. So you can't get rid of them on the basis of they're not performing and they're not
right.
leaving either. But you can see that either the industry or the culture is a If so, how have you handled that?
Um, it's a good question. It happens, right? And it happens for a bunch of different reasons. Like we just had someone leave not too long ago. We don't have a lot of people leave. People tend to stay if they stick through, the first 3 or 4 years, and they tend to be here a long time, especially on the coding team. But we had a long-term sucker puncher decide to leave this year, and his reasons were completely legitimate. I thought they were cultural. He was. There are a lot of things that went into it, but one of the things that went into it was that although Sucker Punch doesn't have a sort of a crunch-centric culture, there is a little bit of expectation that at the end of the project, people will find a little bit of extra time here and there in the week to work on the game to make it better. And one of this person's core issues was that he was like, I feel like we should manage the company so that overtime is never required. And I respect that. It's a completely legitimate viewpoint to have. There are a bunch of reasons, sort of practical, financial, kind of emotional, that mean that we're not going to change to match that. We're still going to try to do as good a job as we can, and we're never going to force people to work overtime. But it is part of our culture that people will find an extra gear when it seems like that will actually have an impact on the project. And so that had been developing for a long time. He had been, not so unhappy that he wanted to leave, but, less than fulfilled 4 years. There are lots of parts of the job that he loved too, right? I mean, he loved working with his coworkers. He liked being part of the teams that were building projects like we were building. But there was something about our culture that rubbed him the wrong way. And eventually it was enough for him to decide he wanted to go do something else. And, Godspeed to him. He was a big part of the company for a long time. He did a lot of really good work. And if at some point he feels like he's going to be happier doing something else, he has my enthusiastic support, right? I mean, he was making a decision that was the best decision for him, even though it wasn't the decision that was best for Sucker Punch. And that's fine. That's going to happen sometimes. Uh, the same things that he found troublesome are things other people really like. So you can't. Sometimes things are what they are, right? You can't do anything. You can't. It's just not going to work perfectly for everybody all the time.
No, wrong. On the topic of obviously people leaving or people going away from the company, with all the recent layoffs that are happening in the industry, I feel like every time I'm turning LinkedIn on or going on to like tech news, some company has laid off X percentage of their staff.
Yeah.
Ways to a fair few people. How has Sucker Punch fared, and what do you think is the actual cause for this turmoil, especially being in a position that
Yeah.
you're in? It's a certain vantage point that a lot of people don't have, and I feel like you could probably speak in a way that openly, in a way that I know a lot of other people are very apprehensive, especially on a podcast, because I know a lot
Yeah.
of people, like, they're already either struggling or they want to keep their job, and they don't want to rock the boat even though they have an opinion.
Yeah, it's tough, for the reasons that you mentioned, and I only know what I know, right? I mean, so I kind of know a lot about Sucker Punch and how we work, and why we work the way we do. I know a little bit about Sony, the greater sort of PlayStation Studios culture and how we think about things, but I'm not an expert in like the inner dynamics of the Ubisoft Montreal office, right? So when I see layoffs happening, I um, I can't really comment too much. We've done one. We had after Second Son shipped, we did a fairly big riff at Sucker Punch. It was the worst day of my life. It was horrible, but we did do one, and it was for um, practical financial reasons. We were about to set off on the project that eventually became Ghost of Tsushima. We were starting from scratch. It was a white sheet of paper design, and um, we couldn't we didn't feel like we could afford to have the same size team we'd had at the end of Second Son and continue forward with that team when we didn't really know the game we were building. Um, and it took us a while. It took us a year and a half before we started working on the actual concept that was Ghost. And that was a year and a half of um, not really having enough things for people to do. And we really felt like we needed to get a little bit smaller in order to have the financial flexibility to explore. We could have made another Infamous game, but that we felt like there was something bigger than that in us. We could do a game that was like a true Game of the Year candidate game, and but that was going to take some exploration. And for better or for worse, we decided that we needed more runway, and that was going to mean working with a smaller team. So we, we said goodbye to some really smart people that went on to, work and have good careers elsewhere, but not with us. And that was really, I don't know, it was super painful. As I said, worst day of my professional career, the day where we actually did that. So we didn't we didn't let anybody go from Sucker Punch during this sort of round of people having layoffs. And I don't know. It's hard for me to talk about, without going into details that I can't talk about. But we haven't this time. I feel the same empathy that everyone has to people that have been affected, people that have lost their jobs, that are now looking for something new at a time when, the problem is that if people are laying people off, there probably aren't a lot of people that are hiring at the same time. And so it's really tough. And my heart goes out to people that are in that situation. I've been on the other side of it too. And so I know that, or I suspect, I only know that when we were in a position where we needed to do a layoff, it was very personally painful. I suspect that that is true for people at other companies making the same decision. That I'm sure there are people out there that are actually greedy and heartless and are just doing this to line their own pockets. That's not my personal experience. And when I've talked to people that I know in the industry that have been in this position of doing layoffs, it's incredibly painful for them. But they either were forced to do it because someone above them in their hierarchy said they needed to, or they concluded it on their own that they needed to do it. That there were reasons why it was best for the company, if not for the individuals, that a riff happened. And it wasn't, certainly for me and for the people I've talked to, it's never something that people are doing lightly or selfishly. It tends to be something where, just has to happen. There's not enough money to pay everybody. So I kind of, have both empathy for the people that are affected, but also for, the people that are having to make those decisions. So,
So
and as to why it happened, you actually asked a question. I didn't answer it. Why is it happening now?
yeah,
Well, it kind of goes up and down the games industry no matter what, right? Like there's, in the 25 plus years I've been in the games industry, there's never been a time where there weren't companies that were having to lay people off. It just always happens. It's happened more lately. Um, it's a cyclical thing, right? During the pandemic, video game sales went up. A lot of people's eyes lit up, and they said, "Hey, there's an opportunity for us to we should jump on this. We should scale up our teams. We should be working on more projects. We should ramp up our ambition. We should take bigger swings at things." And then, once we got into the stage we're at now in the pandemic, where things are sort of under control, that surge in video game sales, which seemed like it was maybe going to be a permanent thing, ended up being a temporary thing. And so now we're back more to the sort of demand we were seeing, before the pandemic. Still a healthy business there, but there are only so many dollars people are spending on video games, and now it's the economics weren't working out, and a lot of people overexpanded for what the market ended up being. And that's just, when the money runs out, the money runs out. It's too bad when you get into that situation, but that's it's kind of the way things go sometimes. Like, a mistake was made, and there's can't just keep these teams running if the games they're making aren't going to sell. And that is what it boils down to at the end of the day, right? I mean, it's a privilege, I think, to work on these things, to be able to build games, to put smiles on faces, right? To be an important part of people's lives. But it only works. I only get to have this job if I actually make games that people are willing to pay money to play, right? That's what keeps the lights on at Sucker Punch. And so, if we get ourselves into a situation where we're we have to keep doing that, we have to keep making games that people want to play, or we're not going to be allowed to do it anymore. That's just how it works.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point that you made about COVID and the ramping up in hiring. Then obviously that didn't, continue in terms of the demand, because obviously cinemas opened back up,
Yeah,
concerts opened back up. People that just go out in general, even just for to the park, for example. Like there's so many things. It wasn't even just paid activities. A lot of things opened back up, and people was like, okay, we aren't stuck to watching Netflix
right.
or playing games or listening to music at home. We can actually do other stuff.
Yep.
Because I see a lot of people online in response to these layoffs, and I'd say anytime these major layoffs occur, is blaming corporate greed, blaming studios that okay, they don't care about their employees. I don't think it's 100%. I think can be an element to that. What I would personally like to see, because I think some of the solutions that the average person, like on LinkedIn or online, is talking about with studios, the not firing people, or keeping people on, or not paying certain people as much, and then making sure certain people don't get let go. I don't think that's going to happen, but what I would like to see is more transparency, because
Mm-hmm.
I personally believe, like, a studio or tech company that lay off, let's say, 1,000 people, they don't wake up one day, look at their accounts, and decide, okay, shit, shit's hit the fan. We need to get rid of people. I think it's a pretty slow process. They realize things aren't going the way they want to, and they slowly start, maybe even trying to correct their direction, maybe try and hold on, and then they start, I guess, making a list of the people or the departments that need to be let go. What I would like to see is that, okay, if somebody's on a list of that somebody that might get fired, have a discussion with them. And this is a very difficult one, because I know you can cause mass hysteria, mass panic within
Yeah.
a company, when you start talking to people that they're going to get fired but not yet. But eh, for employees and employers to get to a position where you can sit somebody and say, things aren't going as well in the company as we had hoped, you're fine for now. In 2 months, that may change, and
Yeah.
we understand you have a family, or you have certain responsibilities. We It's not a reflection on your work. That's not what it is. But we don't know if we can keep you on in 2 months. So
Yeah.
this is your warning. But then likewise, the employees need to be in a mental and emotional state where they're like, okay, I might be looking for something else, or it's in my mind, but for those 2 months that I'm there, or however long, I'm still working, I'm still focused. Like, what do you think of that approach? And do you think we could ever get to something more like that, where there is a more honest discussion beforehand?
That's a super interesting question for Han. It probably depends on company culture as well. I'd answer it in a few ways. I think that if someone is in a situation where, and it kind of depends on what sort of layoff you have too, right? I mean, sometimes you're doing an actual RIF, reduction in force, where you're actually saying, we don't need to have, we've decided to outsource some part of what we're doing, whether it's, whatever it is, right? We've decided we're no longer going to have an in-house QA, we're going to outsource QA. Then it really isn't so much about the particular level of impact a single QA staffer has, so much as, well, that whole group's going away, right? If it is something where you've decided your company, some part of your company is 2 times too big, right? You have twice as many programmers as you need, and you're now going to, you're going to lose half your programming team. You would hope that whatever performance improvement plan you have with people, or performance review, whatever you're going to do to help people in their personal growth, you should be doing that all the time. And if it's a surprise to someone that they're struggling, that's a breakdown that happened long before you got to the point of laying them off. So ideally, people have an idea of where they stand, and more importantly, what they need to do to improve, and have that in mind at all times, not just at a point when the company's in crisis. It's tough, though. It's tough that I think working on video games is interesting in that it's kind of a faith-based thing, right? Where when you're working on a game, it usually sucks until the very, very end when it looks great. But in the meantime, it has all sorts of problems. Things are buggy, or things don't look good, or it runs at 8 frames a second, or the core game design loops just aren't very well designed. And that's certainly true of our games. All of our games are pretty bad until pretty close to the end. And so working on them is an exercise in faith, right? Where you're like, okay, this isn't good now, but everyone around me says it's going to get better. I'm going to believe it. I'm going to keep working hard and focusing and doing the things I can do to make the game better, to fix the problems that I see. And that's delicate, right? It's hard. It's easier to have that level of faith, that level of optimism, and to be productive, to make the difference that you need to make when you feel like things are going well. And if you feel like the company's in trouble, where you're like, oh gosh, I don't know, this payroll we're fine, the next one I'm not sure, that's really hard, I think. It's hard to then generate that level of optimism that you need to have in order to deal with the fact that the game isn't very good when you're working on it. And it's easy to get depressed. And so I have empathy for people that are like, even if we know things are going sideways, but we feel like our best chance to succeed, to make it through this, right? Because sometimes things look like they're going to go sideways and they don't. Our best chance to make it through this is to do a great job over the next 6 months. And if we do, then, maybe we'll make it through this. Maybe the game will actually end up turning the corner and will be good enough that we'll be given, by whoever's financing things, enough time and resources to turn it into the game we think it can be. And as a manager, that's pretty seductive, right? You're like, okay, well, the path that leads to success for all of us is for everybody to be as committed and as focused as they can be. And so as a manager, what I'm going to do is I'm going to shield them from the bad news. I'm going to shield them from the idea that we actually might have problems making the payroll after this one, because that environment of everyone being confident and feeling like things are going well, we just need to keep our heads down and keep working on things. That's the path that's most likely to lead to success and us not having to let people go. That having that kind of, confident culture is a success factor. And so doing things which make it less likely to succeed might seem more humane, but at the same time, it also might be kind of, sentencing your project to failure. So, I think those are the dynamics that you have to think about when you're thinking about how open to be about, the struggles that you're having. So I don't know. I mean, it's super hard. And again, I only have insight into what we've gone through. But I think it might be more complicated often than just wanting to be as open as possible. There's something to be said for that. But at the same time, there's second order dynamics to everything that make it more complicated. Maybe I'm just overcomplicating things. Maybe I'm overthinking this. Maybe it is as simple as you say. But if I were in that position, my goal is typically to um, put people in a position where they can be the best version of themselves. And most people are better versions of themselves when they're not worried about their job, not thinking they're about to lose their job. That very rarely, for some people, sometimes, a shift kick in the shins is what they need. And they need to say, look, if you don't stop this, you're going to lose your job. And that will cause them to trim their sails and do what they need to do. But for most people, that just sends them into a tailspin, and they're not effective at all. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If you tell someone that their performance is such that they're in danger of losing their job, that often causes them to do more poorly, not better. And yeah, you've been open, but I understand the temptation to say that I want to help people succeed. I don't want to put them in a position where they're going to fail, even if that means maybe not being as open with them about the details of their performance as, from the outside, it seems like you might want to be.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is when you do obviously have studios that are larger, companies that are larger, you're responsible for the whole studio. And I think it's like when you get a cancer in the body, initially you don't want to chop it out. You want to try and treat it. You want to ideally keep the arm, the leg, whatever part of the body might
Yeah.
be. But then it might get to a point where, your efforts haven't been effective and you do need to chop out that cancer. And again, that's not saying that the people that you get rid of are bad in themselves. Again, it might
Oh,
just
no.
they're just surplus to requirements at in that moment. But obviously if you have 1,000 people in the company, you've got to think about the 900 more than the 100. And that's obviously
Yeah.
difficult for the 100, the people that are within the 100 group to hear, because
Yeah.
I'm sure most of the time the people that aren't getting laid off, they're not standing up and saying, I feel bad for the 100 that got laid off, they can have my job, I'll leave. Like, I don't hear about people saying that, and or just en masse leaving, because again, you've got to be you're thinking as an individual, you're thinking for yourself. As a company, you're thinking for the entirety of yourself, which is the whole company and everyone that's involved. So it is difficult. I don't think there is a one, bullet solution that just fixes all of it. And also the fact that that if you continue working, like you're saying, and try and deliver the best product, even if you're going to have to lay off people, it still provides the studio the best chance of survival, which provides the best chance of survival, maybe not for an individual person, but for the majority of people, ignoring individual names. And I think that's obviously something I think individual people, like employees, need to understand that you can at any moment be surplus to requirements, nothing to do with the effectiveness of your work and what you're doing, and
Yeah.
you know have backups in place. And again, this is something that employers, I think some employers, don't like. They want you to be fully focused, and I think there needs to be for employees an element of, okay, I need to have other things in the background, whether it's savings, investments, have you know have a good network that if shit does hit the fan, I can reach out to them and get another job, whatever it is. And because you got to do what's best for you, the company's going to do what's best for itself, which is again
Yeah.
the entirety.
Yeah. I think that's right. Obviously, everyone should have a backup plan. So I think that I you also want to make sure that you're doing, I mean, you don't want to be so focused on what could go wrong that you're preventing things from going right.
Yeah.
Just sort of, I'm old enough to have kids that are working age, so kind of improne to giving career advice. Sorry. But you do want to focus on what you're doing, right? And do a great job at it, because that's the thing that's most likely to lead to your success long term. So it is true that things can go sideways in our lives for whatever reason on whatever axis, and it's best to be in a position where you can withstand that. At the same time, you want to make sure you're focusing on your primary task, whatever that is, your primary work, um, so that that's what's going to lead to success in the long run is doing a great job at the thing you're doing.
Oh yeah. On a slightly lighter side note, when are we seeing a new Infamous game? A remake or remaster? You don't even
I
have
cannot. It's an
to.
excellent attempt, Prahan. I am not telling you anything. I can't tell you anything about anything. So that's one of the things about working on. It's actually one of the things about working on sort of big budget AAA games is that um, the it's I'm only a small part of this, right? We have 170 people or so here. We have people working at Sony. We outsource. We have all this sort of marketing and things that happen, and there is a plan for all of that about when all the news about everything comes out. And I that means that while we're in most of the development process for our games, I'm not allowed to even admit more than that we are working on a game. And so that's kind of where we're at right now. And so I think we've said publicly that there's not going to be another Sly Cooper game from us anytime soon. And I don't remember what we said about Infamous, but the Infamous games were great to work on. So we'll have to see how things play out. But um, whatever.
So I'm sure you can answer this one. With Infamous, anyone that's played it, they will remember there was a drastic change in the art style from the PS3 ones to the PS4
Yeah.
one. Obviously, you went to a more from a comic book style, which I love that one, to the more realistic,
Oh, you're right.
on PS4. And it's still to this day, it's considered as an amazing looking game, even while
Yeah.
a decade on. What made you do that change? Because a lot of people love that that comic book style as well.
Yeah, yeah, especially with the graphic cutscenes that we've always done.
Yes.
It was that change to go from the sort of hand drawn graphic novel style stuff that we did in Infamous One and Two to the more kind of innovative stuff that we did in Second Son. Really was the guys that built it had an idea of something that they wanted to do that would be very different. And so we gave them the runway to do it. We had enough time. It was like a 3.5-year project. That was enough time for them to do a bunch of R&D at the beginning. A lot of it was physical, practical, by the way. A lot of the effects that you saw in Infamous were us actually shooting through a kind of high-end red camera, us using airbrushes to blow ink around on paper. Which is crazy, but it wasn't digital. We actually did that physical and filmed it.
What
And
made you do that? Because at that point you could easily have done it digitally from a budget or just from a technical standpoint.
a lot of that, you'd say that, but a lot of that stuff actually turns out to be pretty hard to do with VFX tools. We felt like we could do things practically that were strong enough that it was, I don't know, that's what they wanted to do. And as you say, there are people that love the style of the first two Infamous games. We felt like the people that were doing it were really called to do something that felt really new and fresh. I liked it. I liked them both, but I did appreciate the fact that we weren't just doing what we'd done, that we were going off and trying something new. I thought the stuff they did was neat. And it's a fun way for, those games it was fun to have that stuff. It was born of necessity to begin with. When we first did those, because we'd done the graphic cutscenes all the way back to Sly Cooper 1, we had done those out of necessity. We were a small team. We still are a small team compared to what we're trying to do. But at that point, we were a very small team. There were like 20-something people on the Sly 1 team. And we wanted to tell stories, but we didn't have the resources to do big, high budget cutscenes for things. And we needed to be more creative. And we saw an opportunity to bring together some of the, comic, graphic novel background from a lot of the people on the team with our need for storytelling to bridge this gap, to have a creative solution that both, scratched a creative itch and also told the stories we wanted to tell. And so that was, we got a little bit more mature with the Infamous games. And it was still the same thing with Second Son, even the art style changed a little bit. It was just, people, you want to you want to have your creative people be creative, right? You want to put them in a position where they can be creative, and that's what they felt called to do. It was neat. It's neat stuff. You can look at it on the web now if you don't have a PS4 to run or PS5 to run those games. Um, I don't know. It was cool. I liked it, and I liked the fact that we took the chance to do that stuff. So
Uh, so, in what capacity did you, operate on Ghost of Tsushima? Plus, having founded Sucker Punch all those years ago, how has your role at the company changed? 'Cause I'm sure it was very different
yeah,
when you first started it as a co-founder versus now on Ghost of Tsushima, which eventually became, went on to become like not just a really good game, but the game.
yeah. Thanks for that. Ghost was a very long project for us. We spent about 6 years working on it, which is too long, much longer than we'd like it to be. But as I said, we spent the first year and a half just figuring out what we wanted to do. There's a video floating around on YouTube that you can see the actual vertical slice of the game that we thought we were going to build for the first 18 months, maybe the last 12 months of the 18 months that we decided not to build. Um, Before pivoting to do what became Ghost. So it was a long game. And at the start of it, before the start of it, I actually um, I told my managers at Sony that I thought that Ghost was going to be my last game. I was up for one more game, but I was, the pressure and the stress of building a game like the ones we were doing I was ready to do something new. um, I was ready to go off and write books and do other things. And I was expecting it to be over much more quickly than 6.5 years, but that's how long it lasted. With Ghost, my role changed a little bit. We wanted to have me in place for a project while we had someone else run the coding team. So I handed over day-to-day responsibilities for managing the coding team to someone else, and wasn't as disruptive with the game design on Ghost as I often had been in the past. So again, hand some responsibilities over to other people, and ended up taking a fairly narrow role on Ghost. I kind of poked my head into other things as well, but mostly I worked on the melee combat in Ghost, and did a lot of the game design and most of the programming, and just had a very kind of focused and narrow role. So my job did shift from being running the programming team, helping run the company, and also working on game design and programming, to being more focused on the game design and programming side of it. It still helped a little bit with the coding team and with running the company, but my focus was even more on my individual contribution. Um, so that's how my role shifted. And then after Ghost, I switched, and now I work about half time at Sucker Punch. So 20 to 30 hours a week, I'm in here at work.
Okay. So what are you doing the other 24 or 30 hours? Are you doing some other work? Are you
I,
relaxing, spending
I'm
time with family? Plus, you
yeah,
mentioned book as well.
hanging out with my wife, playing golf and stuff. And I wrote a book, which we can probably talk about in a little bit. So that was a part of my halftime job. I've got some personal projects I'm working on now. We'll see whether they ever get programming projects. We'll see whether they ever get interesting enough to actually turn into real published games. But we'll see. So yeah, I keep busy. I also get to travel more now. I'm not, so focused on what we're doing. I can actually take vacations. So that's fun.
Okay. So that book, what's that book called for anyone that's listening that you've published, and what?
Yeah, I wrote a book called The Rules of Programming. I think How to Write Better Code is its name. Probably have copies of it around here somewhere. Um, so we talked earlier about how at Sucker Punch, one of the things we've done for recruiting is to be unafraid of hiring fresh out of college programmers. So a lot of the people on our team, this is the only job they've ever had. They joined us right after college, or they joined us after maybe a year or so working somewhere else. But in any case, they were new in their programming career. And that was true at Microsoft too. That was always part of Microsoft's hiring culture while I was there. We always hired a lot of people fresh off campus. and that's great. It's a way to find people that are smart and motivated, and also kind of unsullied by bad experiences elsewhere. Right? There aren't lessons for them to unlearn that they've learned at some company with a dysfunctional culture. Um, but it does introduce a new problem, which is that you have a bunch of people who've learned how to program and have done all their school courses, but maybe haven't learned the lessons that they really need to learn to be effective as professional programmers. So they've worked on course projects, but at most those are a semester long, right? And it's not that much code to write. Those aren't big projects. Whereas the code that we write, we have to be prepared for it running effectively forever. We have code running in our engine right now that I wrote in 1997. So it's a long time, right? So the way you go about writing code when you're on a big team on code that may be around forever is different than if you're working on a project by yourself on something that's going to be thrown away in a month. You can't, in some ways, you really can't count on universities to teach people how to work on a big team because, for the most part, the people who are teaching the courses are academics, right? They've worked on small to medium-sized projects, usually very cutting-edge things, but they haven't had large-scale engineering experience, and so it's hard to expect them to teach new programmers the lessons they need to know to succeed in that environment. They just don't even see the problems, right? Because they've never had to face them. And so my career has had, was running teams very early on at Microsoft. As I said, it was expanding so quickly that someone needed to run the team, and it ended up being me, even though I was horribly unqualified for it. So I've had a long history of teaching 22-year-olds who know how to program how to actually be software engineers, right? How to actually work on a project on code that's going to last for a long time in a big team. And that's kind of it was a struggle for a long time. How to teach people to do that. Right? I'd see people making the same mistakes over and over again. And struggled really to figure out how to explain to people why the thing they were doing was a mistake, because it didn't seem like a mistake to them. And I finally had a breakthrough at Sucker Punch. It's like 15 years into what a management genius I am. 15 years in to trying to solve this problem, I finally, somebody was, I don't remember who it was. Somebody who's probably still here at Sucker Punch, for the umpteenth time had taken some problem that they were trying to solve and had overcomplicated it, had tried to write a super generic solution to a problem. And I finally was fed up with this, and I said, okay, that's it. No more of this. Unless you have 3 examples of a problem, you're not allowed to write a general solution. And we laughed, and they actually did it, and that actually worked. They actually didn't do this again because they didn't have 3 examples, and they remembered that they had to have 3 examples before they were allowed to write a general solution. And then I was like, oh, wait, that actually kind of worked. I had 15 years of failing to teach people this lesson, and then suddenly I actually succeeded in teaching someone this lesson. And that kind of became the template for me to if I had something that I thought was important that most 22-year-olds hadn't figured out yet about how to write code at scale, that's something that was going to run in a large code base with a lot of people over a long period of time, that the way to teach people things was to boil down the lessons into some form that they're going to remember. There's a word, aphorism, in English. It's like every culture has different aphorisms, but it's a stitch in time saves 9, or haste makes waste, all these sayings that everyone knows. Everyone knows different sayings, but, sayings that Americans know. That if I could take something I thought was important about programming and boil it down into an aphorism, like don't generalize until you have 3 examples, that I had a hope of people, remembering that lesson and then being able to apply it because they'd remember it. It was catchy. It stuck in their head. And so I started using this technique at Sucker Punch to teach people the lessons. Usually we have a very code review centric culture. So all the code that gets checked into our project has been reviewed by someone. And, for a long time, that was very often me doing the reviews. And so that was an opportunity. In a code review, if I saw someone making a mistake, something I knew was, I understood why they were doing it, but there were going to be negative externalities to whatever way they were doing it.
I'd point it out, and I'd trot out one of the aphorisms about why this was a mistake, and that would help. It was an effective technique for people to learn how to recognize that they were falling into this pattern that was not going to lead to success, and heading a different direction instead. And I started referring to this as the rules of programming. It was kind of a joke, that we would do it. But this was an effective technique, that we had a set of rules, kind of informal rules, but rules about how we were going to write code, and that everyone kind of knew, and that it helped everyone write code that worked well and that was familiar, right? I mean, it's the other thing about working in a large team is that if you have a good set of conventions and a high functioning team, it's going to be difficult to tell who wrote what code in your code base, or at least that's how we think of it. That if I'm into some bit of code and I think, oh, did I write this? It kind of feels like code I wrote, but I don't remember writing it. And oftentimes it's because I didn't write it. Somebody else wrote it. It's just that we all have the same ideas about how to write code through things like the rules, things like our programming conventions, that the code that you're working in always feels familiar, even if it's not code that you wrote. That's great. That's a super productive environment to be in when you're not kind of wasting time trying to figure out whatever this idiot did that was in the code last. And it's like, well, no, it all works the same. It's easy to figure things out. The rules, even though they were very informal, they weren't really written down, were a big part of maintaining that culture where we were able to all work together effectively. So I thought it'd be fun to write a book. You've written books. It's not fun, but it is kind of rewarding. I thought it'd be interesting and a challenge for me to do it, see whether I could do it. And I thought this was an interesting thing to do, to take our informal rules and turn them into something more formal, something with lots of really good supporting examples, a lot of example code, to talk about not only the problem and the rule that addresses it, but also to give people enough context so they could see whether this was a rule that actually applied to the sort of programming that they were doing. Because our rules were very specific to Sucker Punch, right? They were the things that we found to be important to us and our culture for the sort of code we wrote. These were our rules, and I thought that some of them were going to be applicable no matter what kind of programming you were going to do. Others maybe not, right? So I felt like I needed to provide enough context so that people who were reading the book could come to their own decision about whether this particular rule made sense, or whether the concept of rules in general made sense. And that was one of the things I wanted to do. It was one of the reasons why I was going to switch back to working half-time at Sucker Punch. So I did. I mean, that's what I did. It took me a long time, actually, about a year, actually, to figure out how to, I could write. I knew how to string words together in sentences. I knew how to be clear. But it took me a year or so before I found the real voice for the book. That I had about a year of writing where I didn't write all the time because I was frustrated by it, because I would write something about a rule and why it was important and so on. And then I'd read it back and I would be like, oh man, whoever wrote this is a jerk. I don't read anything this person has to write. They're just talking and so whatever. This person's just preaching at me. I'm not going to listen to it. It took me a year before I figured out that, for me at least, when I was reading it back, the thing that made the lessons more palatable was to have examples, to actually back everything up with code. And so once I discovered that, then the writing process for me got easier. I didn't feel like I was just being a jerk. I was actually saying things where someone who was reading it could come to their own conclusions about whether they believed or not, but at least I didn't feel like I was just preaching at people. And so that was my process eventually. I eventually ended up in a point where the first thing I did before I wrote a chapter, I had a list of all the rules I wanted to write, not all of which kind of lent themselves well to being a chapter in a book, so they don't all end up in the book, but the ones that I did write, the first thing I did before I started a chapter was to figure out what the examples were. So I would start every chapter, first not by writing the chapter, but by writing the code examples. And then I would go back, after I had code examples I was happy with, I would go back and write the text to wrap around those examples. So there was kind of a natural progression through the statement of the problem, kind of the pointing out why a particular approach wasn't making sense, and then the rule that follows from that. So, and it was fun. It was fun. I like one of the rules is about it's about premature optimization, which I think is the one aphorism that everyone who's studied computer science has heard. Right? It's that.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah,
I remember
yeah,
hearing
exactly.
when I was at college and uni as well.
Yeah, exactly. It's premature optimization is the heart of all evil, or something like that. So, and I was like, that's absolutely something uh, would tell people when they were trying to make things fast too early. And so, when I wrote the book, I did something where I wrote something, and I just used ordinary care, because that's actually what we would tell people is, don't do stupid things, use ordinary care, but don't worry about how fast your code's going to be until you discover that it's a problem. That your natural tendency as a programmer is going to be to overfocus on it. So even if you try not to worry about it, you're still going to worry about it too much. So use ordinary care. Write code that's as simple as possible and as clear as possible that solves the problem. That is what you do when you write something. That's rule number 1 in the book. And rule number 5 is don't worry about how fast it runs. It's going to run fast enough. I guarantee it'll run fast enough. Am I going to be wrong? Yeah, 3% of the time I'm wrong. But guess what? Like, if you've taken ordinary care when you wrote it and you need to optimize it, you're going to be able to make it run 10 times faster without even trying. That is the rule of thumb in the book. Like, you can get a 10x speed up, no problem. The first time you try to optimize something, it's going to go 10 times as fast. So I wrote some code, and I was like, I wonder whether I actually did it. I was like, okay, I'm going to write some code, and I did. It's the example that's in the book, and it's generating a bunch of weighted randomization sequences. So something where you've got 10 choices, and they each have a percentage chance of happening, and you need to do 10,000 of them. For whatever reason. I don't explain why you would need to do this, but I'm just saying, that's it. I write code using ordinary care. Let's assume this is generally going to be okay. In fact, it is the code that we use to do weighted randomization, so I know it's fine. But whatever. In this particular case, you're doing it so much that it's too slow. You actually have to speed it up. You instrument your code, you run the profiler, and it's like, oh, this is actually killing us. Is spending half of our time we're spending on this single function. We have to make it faster. So I wrote it. I did it just like I would normally do. Use ordinary care. I typed basically the code we use at Sucker Punch. And I'm like, okay, let's run the test. Let's see whether I can actually do it. And I do a first attempt. It doesn't help. I talk about it in the book. And I do a second attempt, and it completely works, and it's 10 times faster. And I'm like, okay, I'm vindicated, right? And so once I was able to do chapters like that, where I actually can show the code that I wrote, the ordinary care code, the code you should write, and then the faster options, then I could string a chapter around that, and it would kind of resonate. You could kind of see that it made sense. Although the funny thing was that then the best part of this is that there's like the one chapter in the book where afterwards, there's a Socratic dialogue in the book, because I had a bunch of people at Sucker Punch, and then the friends of mine that are senior engineers that don't work at Sucker Punch read the book, and this is the one chapter in the book that people were like, "Oh, I do not believe that at all, Chris. You're so wrong about this." And I'm like, okay, well, I appreciate where you're coming from, and I want to represent this point of view. With this chapter, I'm not going to change the chapter, but there's an extra bonus kind of half chapter afterwards, which is a Socratic dialogue between me and the syncretic voice of everyone who objected to this, talking through their objections and where those objections are completely valid, and where those objections maybe aren't so valid. So it's I don't know. I don't know whether people reading the book are going to enjoy that chapter. Whatever. But I enjoyed writing it. So that was what was important in that case, I think, for me at least.
Yeah, that's definitely. I like that the book, is about, it's essentially focusing on, actually do something instead of premature optimization, abstracting. Like, that's definitely a huge problem, especially with all the object oriented nature of
Yep.
languages and frameworks nowadays. It is okay, let's just make everything abstract straight away, so in our ideal world we can reuse every little
Right.
bit of code or component that we create as many times as possible. And I like the example that you gave, where if you can't think of free instances where it needs to be used, then you need to think about, does it actually need to have some sort of abstraction or some sort of
Yeah.
generalization created about it? Because I know that's something I've worked on in myself, where earlier in my career, especially when I was at university, and you start learning about classes in C++, you're coming from C, and you think, okay, I'm just going to make everything abstract, I'm going to do it as general as
Yep.
possible. And but it gets to a point where you're spending so much time on code for code's sake, and in forgetting that, okay, if you're making a game, the end goal is to make a game. The
Yeah.
end goal is
Exactly.
not to make code that runs so well, but the game either doesn't come to fruition or it's rubbish, because you've lost the focus of the end product. Nobody wants to play a game that feels boring at 120 frames per second, that is coded the best in the world. They
Yeah.
would rather have maybe something that's slightly buggy, or there's a few things under the hood that are a bit maybe patched together, but it feels so good, and then you fix
Yeah.
the problems later.
I think that's right. There are two sides to that particular rule. The rule of don't generalize until you have three examples. Part of it is the half we've talked about, which is that um, and you probably don't understand the problem when you have one example, and so your attempts to write a general solution to it are doomed. You just don't understand what the second example or the third example is going to be. You're always surprised. I'm always surprised by it. And so if I try to write a general solution to give me one example, even with all the experience that I have, I'm going to get it wrong. It's not just that you don't want to optimize; it's that your general solution is not going to actually fit the problems you run into. But there's a second half to it too, which is that once you do have, it's not that generalization is bad. Once you do have three examples or four, however many, you should generalize. You should go back and change the code so that it does solve a more general problem. Once you have enough examples to understand the general problem. One example is not enough. You just don't understand the general problem. Once you understand the general problem, go ahead and write a general solution to it. That's fine. And so, in fact, a lot of our programming practice, our culture at Sucker Punch, and the reason why our kind of prime directive, our rule number one, is to write code that's as simple and clear as possible, is that that's the sort of code that's easy to change later, right? So when you do discover that you've got a more general problem, then it's easy to take this simple code and change it to match the general problem, to solve the general problem, than it is to take complicated code. The simpler the code is, the easier it is to change. And so that helps you be reactive to the technical things you run into, or the game design things you run into, or whatever, right? The simpler the code is, the more easy it's going to be to react to the unexpected. And so that's maybe the biggest reason to keep it all simple, so that you can react to the unexpected, because that's what game development is, right? Or at least in my experience, all the games we built, we haven't known what we were doing. We just kind of blundered off in a direction and just kept, chasing the fun, right? Like figuring out what was working, doing more of it, making it better, figuring out what wasn't working and getting rid of it. And that is something we can do, I think, in large part because we're so focused on keeping our code base simple and malleable, so that when we run into things that we didn't anticipate, we can react to them.
Yeah, that's a very important part, where you said that looking at the first, version, or the first, instance, first problem, you might not understand the best, actual optimized solution, yet you are trying to create the best optimized solution. You could have, let's say there might be 10 problems or 10 scenarios where, this pops up, but the first one might be totally different to the other nine. The other nine might be the actual
Yep.
general, way it comes about, but the first one might be an anomaly. So, optimizing or abstracting for the first one, it might not only hinder the performance or the end result of 2 to 10, it might also mean you're having to go back on yourself and
Yep.
redo the work and spend more time because you didn't have the
Yep.
viewpoint.
Yep. I think that's, I mean, and that's kind of our our philosophy is that that's not a problem to be dealt with. That's something to be embraced. That like your code is going to evolve because your understanding of the problem you're trying to solve is going to evolve. And so knowing that, you need to write your code so that it can evolve. And that's why you want to keep it simple. It's going to evolve. You're going to have to change it. It's going to be easier to change if it's simple. So just write it as simple as you can to begin with, because it's going to pay off in the long run.
Oh yeah, and I think that's the case with projects as well. And I'm sure, like you were saying, Ghost of Tsushima took you 6 years to make, and initially you didn't know exactly what you was gonna do. And I'm sure at the start you thought, are we gonna do a new Infamous game? Are we gonna,
Yep.
maybe do some DLC? Are we gonna maybe do a Sly game? Probably something closer to what you had already done. If you had just said, okay, the first day we sit down, by the end of the day, we're having the idea and we're just running with that instead of obviously, having multiple different ideas, multiple different versions. You would have to step back and say, okay, this is where we want to go down. This is where we can focus our efforts. And I think that's the same way when you are on a micro level creating something. You've got to, have a decent vantage point where your efforts are going to be worthwhile. They're going to actually yield results. And the fact that you want to try and optimize, that you are actually going to end up optimizing and not just sort of stabbing in the dark just because you kind of should probably optimize at some stage. So you're just going to do it beforehand.
Yeah. Yep. That's right. And I think that's true, not just for code, but for, like if you're working on the design of a game, you can prematurely optimize part of your game and the design of the game just as easily as in the code of the game. You do need to figure out what's actually important, what's actually great about your game, and you've got to know that. Otherwise, you're not going to make good decisions about what to focus on. When I talk to people that are new to game design, or when people pitch me their games, that tends to be the mistake, or at least from my point of view. Yeah, lots of different ways to make games. I don't think my way is the only way, but or our way. But I think that's the thing that we would focus on as a design organization, is to understand what the main thing is about your game. Like what is the thing that's actually fun and interesting and novel about your game? What's the thing that why do people play your game? Like what's the metaphor I would use is, what's the engine that's pulling the train, right? You got a lot of things in your game that have to be there, that are not why people are playing. You have to understand what it is that's pulling you in and pulling you through the game experience, or what small set of things. Maybe you're a game like Ghost, you're selling to so many different kinds of players that, for some people it's the beautiful visuals, for some people it's the gameplay, for some people it's the story, right? And like a lot of people get pulled through the game for different reasons, but we have to understand what are the important things that pull people through the game so that we can properly focus on them. And I think a lot of junior designers make the mistake of getting lost in all the details initially, or thinking that the complexity of the idea is what makes it a good idea. Where I think it's better to focus on what's the core idea, what's the core thing that you're doing well, and making sure that you're really doing a great job at that. I don't know, like I'm playing Dave the Diver is a game that I'm playing right now, and it's a great game, super fun. But if the scuba diving isn't fun, that game is not fun, right? Like you could get focused on all the crazy things on the periphery of that game, of like keeping track of every single species of fish you've killed or whatever. And it's all there, but that's not what's pulling the train. What's pulling the train is the actual experience of going scuba diving for me. Um, uh, and they did a good job of focusing on that. If you want to build a game that's successful, you need to figure out what's the scuba diving for your game, right? Like for Ghost, we know what it is. For Ghost, it's the melee combat and it's the beautiful visuals, and the story. But actually, kind of the first two are going to pull you into the third one. And there's a lot of other great work in that game. But if the game's not beautiful and if the sword combat isn't great, the game doesn't succeed. And so that's why we put a crazy amount of effort into both of those things over the course of the game to make sure they were as good as we knew how to make them, because those were going to be the engines that pulled the train of the rest of the game.
Oh yeah, and just talking about the visuals of and just Ghost of Tsushima in general, the visuals of Ghost of Tsushima was the thing that drew me into it. I didn't
Yeah,
play it on launch. I played it not long after, but
yeah,
I did buy it when the PS5 had come out, but before the PS5 version.
yeah,
So I did basically, I think it was play the PS4 Pro version
yeah,
on the
right,
PS5, but it was seeing those beautiful gameplay videos on YouTube and just snippets
yeah,
where he's just on the horse, he's riding through the fields of the
yeah,
flowers, either the greys and the blacks and whites, or the colors. And that game is one of the best examples of a video game that I feel like if you was gonna get a little screenshot or snippet of a game and put it on the wall as a piece of art, this would be it.
yeah,
It actually felt like, man, this is a piece of art. And then it just has so happened to play really well. It's just so happened to run really well. It happened
right,
that the story and the characters were also really well designed, and that those were bonuses. But the visuals, it was. I'm sure you get this all the time. It
yeah.
was just absolutely amazing.
Yeah, it was, and that's a credit to a really talented team building all of that stuff, both on the technical side and on the art side. And a lot of people, not being satisfied with their work and continuing to make it better. And it's some of it's subtle. It's stuff that, I mean, like a lot of the thing that I think a lot of people react positively to in Ghost visually is just the vistas, right? Just the idea that I come across a hill and suddenly it's just gorgeous in front of me. And one of the things that's interesting that we've talked about, I think, in talks at the Game Developers Conference and stuff, is how we actually had to go through a process of recognizing that that moment of coming around a corner or going across a mountain pass and seeing this beautiful world in front of you um, was the key moment. And then rebuilding some of our stuff, some of the environments to make sure that that was happening more often. Like we had times when there were too many trees in the world, and trees look great, but they were blocking the view, right? And so we went through this phase we called weed whacking, where we'd be like, okay, you're not seeing this site often enough. There's this important location in the game, and I'm going to it on a road, and I just don't see it often enough. And the team would identify all the places like that and then go down and just chop all the trees down, basically. Just paint the trees out so there are no trees there. So suddenly you had a view where beforehand you didn't have the view. And so there is that sort of recognizing this point during the, that's why it takes 6 years, right? Is that we had this point where we recognized that one of the real strengths of what we were doing was how gorgeous everything was. But then realizing at the same time that we were shooting ourselves in the foot, we were hiding it too often. That the trees were part of what made it gorgeous, but if the trees were in the way all the time, that you were hurting the game, and then realizing that we need to have a whole process for figuring out where we were doing this and where we needed to open up the views, how we were going to do the landscape design effectively, in addition to all the beautiful assets that we had and the tech to draw them.
Oh yeah, like that game. I know you said earlier that you spent 6 years working on the game, studio did, and it was way too long. But I would argue that what you got out of it, obviously, maybe whilst you was working on the game, it felt like too long. You're thinking, oh, actually, out of curiosity, how long did the previous games make? I mean, Take Two.
Oh yeah, they've been getting longer. So let's see. The Sly Cooper games took Rocket, our first game, took 2 years. Then Sly 1, 2, and 3 took 3, 2, and 1 years, respectively, ish. The first Infamous game took 3.5 years. The second Infamous 2 took maybe 2.5. The Second Son took maybe 3.5, and then 6. so,
Pretty much double what any of the others took.
it was a lot more. And you appreciate that it, like 3 years is a long time, right? Like 3.5 years is as long as I spent in university, right? That's a long time. Um, but 6 was something else entirely. It
Mm.
got, and I said earlier that our games suck until the end. The same was true, right? We had something that was a kind of a samurai game, but it wasn't great. We had some stuff, but it was all, we changed so much about what we were doing, right? We were doing a really big game. We've done open world games. The infamous games are open world games, but they're city sized open world games. They're not, Tsushima style open world games. And so our whole tech stack had changed. The style of game had changed. We'd never done a melee focused game. There were so many things we were changing that it just took us a long time to really find our way. Even after we settled on Ghost, when we did do that pivot, so a year and a half into development of Ghost, when we did pivot, we pivoted to exactly Ghost. The pitch that we made for Ghost is pretty much exactly the game we built. So we were lucky in that we knew what we were trying to build. We actually got that right. It took us a long time to figure out everything we needed to figure out in terms of technology and our design process and the team we needed to hire to build the game, because it was a different team than we used to build Second Son. It just took us a long time to do that. But we did. And again, in the end, it's our best game. So I definitely the most impressive game we've built. And I have a special place in my heart for Sly Cooper 2, which is an awesome game. But it's the game that I'm most proud of, Ghost of Tsushima. So was it worth it in the end? Yeah, it probably was, even though it took too long.
So before I forget, your book, The Rules of Programming, you've been kind enough to give away a copy for a lucky
Yes, I
winner.
have.
And thank you very much for that, Chris. Or anyone that's listening, all you have to do is just leave a rating on any podcast platform that you're listening to this on, and just put a comment of what's your favorite Sucker Punch game.
Oh, there we go. That's an interesting survey to run for Han.
Yeah.
You're gonna have to share the results with me.
I'm sure you can probably guess what the game. I feel like a lot of people probably be Ghost or Infamous, but you never know. It might even be Sly or one of your first game. But yeah, that's all you have to do. And anyone that's listening, thinking, interested in buying the book, is buy O'Reilly, and definitely recommend it, because all the royalties go to Girls Who Code as well. That
That's right.
organization.
Yeah,
So
that's right.
so it's great to buy it as well.
Yep, you can make a change in the world, as well as reading a book about programming.
Yeah. Are you working on another book currently right now, Chris?
I'm thinking about it. It's hard to write a book. It's a lot of work, and I'm thinking about. I don't know. I'm thinking about writing a book about a lot of the stuff we talked about today. Honestly, of what running a creative team, like what sorts of lessons can you take away from my experience of running a high performing technical team and also a creative team at Sucker Punch. How do you think about that problem? Because it's not obvious how to do it, how to build an organization, a programming organization that actually can do really good work reliably over time. And so maybe there's a book there. I don't know. We'll see. As I said, it's a lot of work, but it's fun to see that people have read the programming book, and it's really great that the money goes to Girls Who Code. So they're doing great work. So it's nice to be able to support that.
Oh yeah, it is. And yeah, you're right. Having wrote several books myself, it is definitely a huge undertaking when that's not your main focus. When you are doing, something else. What I would love to see from you, Chris, is obviously you did a book on programming. I would love to
Yeah.
see a book on, actually starting a game studio, because, you actually
Yeah.
started one. You did it for like 2-3 decades, and you made several. You've been part of a team that's made several amazing titles, and they seem to have gotten better every single time, and they've scaled up over from like PS2, PS3,
Yeah.
PS4, 5, Nintendo 64. I'm sure there's been a few differences in the hardware and approaching it, and then also then
Yeah,
being acquired by Sony. I would love to see like that side of it, and
yeah,
more
maybe.
macro, less technical.
Yeah, maybe. I think it's interesting. It's like I think that's the mark of success for me at least. Is I think there are two. One is that we're still around, right? We talked earlier. We talked about the turmoil that's the current wave of turmoil that's going through the video game business and how many studios are being forced to lay people off. Um, that happened, always has happened. It's just that kind of the video game business can be pretty brutal in terms of if you want to start a video game studio, do a project. There are lots of people that are trying to do that. There are lots of games that are out. Like if you look at how many games are out on Steam every single day, there are lots of them, and so you're competing with everybody, right? It's brutal. And if you don't find an audience for your game, you probably can't build the next one, right? Because you have to pay for you have to keep the lights on, right? You have to pay for things. So one mark of our success is that we're still around. We've done 10 games, depending on how you count. It's been 27 years now, so we're still around. So that's a victory. Um, uh, I think that um, we've also done games that people like. I think is also part goes together with that. So I think the key for us has been that we've always been able to find people that had that where it was a calling. Yeah, I think there are two different ways you can approach work, right? You can approach it as a job, or you can approach it as a calling, where you're like, I can't imagine not doing this. Or maybe you would say, are you living to work or are you working to live, right? And I don't know that it's always healthy, but I think that Sucker Punch has attracted people who were living to work, right? That they really, really wanted to make great games and do great work, to really put something out in the world that they could be proud of. And that has stayed constant through our whole history. Even though the size of the company has changed and the hardware we're working on has changed, and the expectations that we and our customers have about what sorts of things we're going to be able to provide, what experiences we're going to be able to provide, have all changed radically. That spirit hasn't changed. That we've been able to attract people that really cared about doing great work, and were excited about the chance to do that at Sucker Punch. That's been the strength that really has made us successful over 27 years, is the strength of everyone here and their belief that we could actually do something great together.
So I remember earlier on you mentioned that when you're hiring people, one of the things that you like to see is people that can, I guess, take accountability, that can reflect on what they've done wrong. What's been your biggest regret in your journey? Obviously,
Ah,
you've built an amazing company, done really well, loads of
yeah.
great games, but I'm sure there's been something that you think, damn, I wish I could have done different or better.
Well, we would need another 2 hours to list them all. I think everyone that works with me at Sucker Punch would tell you that I tend to be pretty negative about what we've done and what we could have done better. In terms of things we've talked about today, I certainly would like to have that year and a half back that we spent finding our way before we started working on Ghost, because there was nothing stopping us from um, starting with Ghost instead of ending up there after an 18-month wander in the desert. Um, so I'd like to have that back. And there are, again, 6 years of development. At the end of it, you're like, that could have gone faster. I wish that we'd been able to compress the Ghost development schedule a little bit, because we could have had it out earlier. We could be farther along, closer to shipping our next game at this point. So, but I don't know. It's I could tell you all the little mistakes I've made, but uh, because there have been many. But it's hard to feel too bad about them, given that we've ended up making some really good games along the way. But yeah, I could go on and on and on about all the stupid things I've done this week. So
Fair enough. So, like, Ghost of Tsushima came out in 2020. It's been, 4 years. No trailer out for the next game. No major. Don't worry, Chris. I'm not asking what the next game is. This is going to be a good question, and one that you can definitely answer. so it's coming up to a similar time frame between Second Son and Ghost of Tsushima. How do you, what are you doing to prevent yourself from getting into the position where Valve has been in, where they had a bunch of great games. The development cycle kind of increased to the point where they just haven't really released a new major game. I know they have Steam, so they got money coming in. It's a slightly
Yeah,
different ball game. But how do you prevent yourself from thinking, okay, we did 3 year, 1 year, 3 years, 6 years? What could we do with 10 years possibly? Like
yeah,
miss out 2 generation consoles almost. Like go to PS7.
yeah, yeah. Right. Do a Duke Nukem. Um, yeah, it's a good question. I won't pretend to be an expert in Valve culture, so I won't talk about them. The, although I think that from the outside, it's like they don't have to ship a game, right? Because Steam is just a money geyser.
And now it's
So,
crazy.
uh, uh, whereas we do, right? Like if we don't keep shipping, we're part of Sony partly because that took some of the stress away. I mean, we ran Sucker Punch as an independent company for 14 years, and there it was. Even though we were successful and we stayed in business and we had a really great partnership with Sony, we were shoving all our chips into the middle of the table on every single hand, right? Every game we did had to succeed. If it didn't, we were out of business. And so merging with Sony, getting acquired by Sony went a long ways towards taking some of that off, some of that pressure off. Nevertheless, if the game that we're working on now isn't good, and it is good, it's going to be great. People are going to love it. It Worst day, I don't know what's going to happen. Whether they would shutter Sucker Punch, we probably get another strike. I bet we get to do 2 bad games before they shut down Sucker Punch. But some will. I mean, if they have to, they will, right? So there is that pressure to continue doing great jobs, and the expectations for a studio like Sucker Punch and at Sony is that we're going to write games that are good enough they're going to make people buy consoles, right? So. That's a high bar, right? So there is a high level of expectation. We did take a year after Ghost was done to work on the Ghost Director's Cut. So we did a bunch of new content that runs in the kind of plussed up version of the Ghost engine. And then we have the PlayStation Plus work that you talked about and the PS5 work. So we spent a year while we were working on the ideas for our new game, where most of the team was busy doing the kind of best possible version of Ghost of Tsushima. That ended up being a great decision because it meant we have an even better version of Ghost than we shipped. That people if you buy it now, that's what you're playing, and it's great. We did some really neat work on Iki Island with the director's cut, so that helped. I think we've gotten better about managing the transition. So we didn't feel like we needed to do a big riff this time, which is great because, again, that was the worst day of my professional career. We've done a better job of managing that transition. This has been a better, a better run project than Ghost was. So I think people will be happy with what we're working on when we're finally able to announce it and put it out into the world.
I'm very excited to see, what you guys are working on next. So, what advice would you give to someone that's looking to start their own game studio? Like, what's
Oh
the
yeah,
biggest, tips and tricks and advice that somebody's thinking? Whether it's obviously a big studio is going to be difficult nowadays, but like they
yeah,
want to, go about and say, okay, me and a couple of friends or colleagues, we want to
yeah.
start a game and do that full time.
Well, it's certainly completely doable, right? I mean, there are lots of great games that are built that way. So maybe it's a little bit harder to like do jump in the way that we did. The amount of I mean, we spent a lot of money making Rocket, but not a crazy amount of money. We did have to hire people. That tends to be the line that you have to jump across, right? Like if you're doing it on your own with your friends, you're all just contributing your effort. That frees things up a little bit, to do it in your spare time, do it on weekends. You can actually do some pretty neat stuff. My advice for someone doing a project like that is to make sure they understand what they're going to do a great job of, and what they're not going to try to do at all. I think that if you're trying to do a small project, that thinking that you're going to do kind of Call of Duty quality visuals or Ghost of Tsushima quality visuals, that's hard. That's going to be hard to pull off unless you've got some real insight into how you're going to do, programmatic generation of content. Gameplay is something that it's easier to be innovative at with a few people. So I think a lot of the games that I see that are successful, that have been built by a small team, are often successful because of that. They have some really great gameplay hook, or they have some really interesting stylized art look that helps pull them through, and at the same time helps manage the work, the cost of producing the assets. Or they have some, really, really super innovative gameplay concept and tech base. Remember, Minecraft was built by one guy, right? So you can have a one-person team that literally changes the world. It is completely doable. It's probably not likely, but it's completely doable. So I think my advice would be that figure out what's going to be special about what you're going to do and focus on that to the exclusion of everything else. Don't worry about the everything else in the game. Just make sure the one thing that's great about it is as great as you can make it. The other bit of practical advice I'd give, is that you have to be ready for failure. You can't be afraid of failing because you're probably going to fail, right? I mean, that's the thing, that so many people are trying to make games now and are making games, that just getting a game done is hard. You may not finish it, right? You might abandon it on your own. You might be forced to abandon it because something else happens in your life, right? And even if you get to the point of putting it up on Steam, the most likely outcome is that not a lot of people are going to play it because there are so many games on Steam. And that's all in some way depressing. It's like, right, I'm going to work really hard at something and I'm likely to fail, which actually I think really leads to the real advice, which is do it because you want to do it. Do it because you love making a game and you can't imagine not making the game, right? Like, do it because you're going to love the process, not because of the outcome that you hope to have. Because you're probably not going to be Notch making Minecraft. You're going to be someone making a game and you're really happy that you did it. And if you get a few thousand people to play it, that's great. That's a huge success. You've outperformed 99% of the people who start trying to make a game. It's like writing a book, right? I mean, it was a fun process for me. It was great to have gone through it. It was a challenging thing for me to do. I hadn't done it before. I didn't know how to do it. I had to figure it all out. And at the end, we sell, I don't know how many, it's like how many people bought the book now, like 8,000 people. Compared to the numbers I'm used to from making Ghost of Tsushima, where it's tens of millions, this is a different thing, right? So I kind of feel like that's the advice I'd give someone making a game, right? Do it because you really want to do it and because you're going to love the process in the way that I wouldn't say I love the process of making a book, but I did find it interesting and challenging and maybe even enjoyable. And so, it was the journey's got to be the reward, if you're going to make a game. It can't be whatever you're hoping for at the end of the rainbow. It's probably not going to happen. So you better enjoy the journey along the way.
So now that we're at the tail end of the podcast, I want to thank you obviously for, coming on today. But one thing I always do with my guests before we wrap up is a rapid fire round of questions. Are you ready for that, Chris?
I am ready, Farhan. I'm ready for the pressure.
Okay. So the first question I think will be really relevant to you because you are running, a company, you've started a company. So would you rather run a 10-person company or a 1,000-person company? So you're in between. You're way past the 10 mark, but you're not quite at the 1,000 mark either. So
I think it really depends on what kind of game I want to make, because there are games that you can make with 10 people, and there are games that take 1,000 people to make. And so it really depends. I think the answer is I mean, it's not surprising. If you've listened all the way through the podcast, you know that I'm a guy who's all about the product. um,
But
and
what would
so,
that be for you? Like, if you had to, let's say, if you left Sucker Punch tomorrow
yeah,
or after the
yeah,
next project, and you were starting another game studio, and you've already mentioned that you're working on some video games, and
yeah.
when it comes to you or an investor comes to you, says, you can have as much money as you want, but you can choose how big you want the studio to be, and you make the game that you want. What would that be? Would that be 10, or would that be like, let's go for it, let's go make Call of Duty or whatever?
It's not going to be Call of Duty. It will be 10 until it's a lot. The game, I actually can answer this question because I'm working on myself. I'm working on a little game myself, and it's kind of more mobile, and that means that it's not very many people when you build it, and then when you actually ship it, suddenly you need a ton of people to actually support it. So I think it's I think it's small to begin with. I think just the answer most people would give you, right, is that it's more fun to run a small team, which is absolutely true. But if your ambition is to, build destiny, you can't do that with 10 people. You can get an idea of what it's going to be like with 10 people, but when you're actually coming to the point of actually generating the content and managing the player base, you're going to need hundreds of people. And so at the moment, the game I'm working on is kind of more of a small game. But if a miracle happens, if lightning strikes again, and we actually manage to find something that people want to plus, if people want to play, then suddenly you need many people to manage that. So I really completely didn't answer your question though. It's way more fun to run a 10-person company, but there's some things you need 1,000 people to do.
Oh yeah, for sure. From that, like, it's not part of my fun, rapid fire questions. So you mentioned this is more of a mobile style game. With
Yeah,
the huge success of mobile of the last 10 to 15 years, and I saw some studio that tried to make that switch to mobile and like free to play, and then they kind of didn't work out for them, and then they went back, and I feel like it was at their detriment in terms of their position in the industry. Why has Sucker Punch never, at least publicly, really,
yeah.
tried to do mobile, and they just stuck with AAA?
Well, it's a completely different skill set. It would be a mistake for us being feeling like the fact that we know how to make games like we make these sort of really big open world, high production value console games. That doesn't in any way uh, qualify us to make Marvel Snap. Maybe there are some things that carry over in terms of how to run a team or whatever, but there's so many things we don't know, and there's so many things we don't even know we don't know, right? The unknown unknowns are just huge if you're really making that radical a shift. So even though I love everyone here at Sucker Punch to death, and I have a ton of respect for them and for us as a company, I wouldn't be confident that we could go off and build a top notch mobile game. It's just so different to what we do. I wouldn't be confident that we could do that. So I think that doing a mobile game and doing a good one, we would need to, calve off some small group of people that were actually going to learn how to do it, or we were going to have to partner with somebody who did know how to do it, and learn that way. But it's not something that we could redirect our team to do. We are the shape of our team in terms of the skill set that we have, the people that we have to do all the work that we need to do is radically different from what you need to build a really great mobile game. And the economics are so wildly different too, right? It's like just what it takes in terms of how do you design a game so that it can thrive in a free to play space is just so alien to how we think about game design. For the purchase price up front, $70, and here's 50 hours of fun. That is a really really different design environment than what you need to do if you want to build a successful mobile game.
Yeah, and that's something I feel like I've got from the podcast, listening to you, and I think the audience as well. You, and I feel like obviously Sucker Punch, by extension, is a very practical, person and studio. You're actually analyzing it and seeing what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are. I think the assumption is if you have the money to throw at it, you should just be able to make it work. Because mobile games initially clearly don't take as much money to get it from concept to release, pretty much every
Right.
mobile game, versus a AAA title like Ghost of Tsushima. But the thing is, like the company that makes Need for Speed, frankly, is not going to make a game as good as Ghost of Tsushima or Call of Duty in that
Yep.
genre. Vice versa, I don't think if Sucker Punch tried to do a racing game, you're going to beat Gran Turismo or
Yeah.
Forza or any of these
Yeah.
other like Need for Speed, any of these actual studios that are fully equipped and they know how to do it. Because again, you
Yep.
can say, okay, I'll try and license some engine that's tailor made for it. Okay, even if you do that, the management style, what that works and doesn't work in terms of making that game and product. It's not just about, okay, I can
Yep.
throw unlimited money at it and I should just be able to make Need for Speed. It's not going to happen, because I'm sure you've experienced it when playing a game that's not a racing game. You step into a vehicle and you think, this driving this car just feels rubbish, even though
Yeah.
the game is amazing. And
Yeah.
it's because it takes effort to do something good. There's very
It is.
few games where if there's something that's out of the ordinary of their gameplay, feels good. Uncharted, with their driving sequence in Uncharted 4, does feel good, but again, it's not Gran Turismo or Forza good for a whole game.
Yep. Yep. That's right. That's right. It's hard, and I think we talked earlier about why the Ghost development cycle was so long and how we spent 18 months wandering in the desert trying to figure out what we were going to do. And a lot of that was because we were trying to step a little bit further out of our lane. Even though Ghost was a big departure from what we'd done in a lot of ways, the ideas we were working on, we were trying to be even more of a departure. And that ended up being a mistake. We overextended a little bit in terms of what we were trying to do, how different the things we were trying to do were from what we'd done in the past. We needed to go back to building on the things that we actually knew how to do and extending them rather than really kind of taking a big leap out into very different kinds of games.
Oh yeah, and it makes sense. But again, it's something that I've seen studios make the mistake of, where they just think, okay, we've got the, let's say, programming and artistic talent, we've got the budget. I'm sure we can just do this other either
Yep.
genre or something different, because it might just be scale as well.
Yep.
Like, again, it might be going down scale, going from $100 million plus style, Halo game to a mobile game that like you said is free to play, is totally different, and it's not to be underestimated, the skills that are involved in it. And a lot of it isn't just technical skills, because again, you can get a technical, let's say, UI programmer that's on a mobile game that could kind of, I guess, do the UI programming on a game like Ghost of Tsushima, maybe with a bit of training. But to actually set up a studio that's full of AAA, people to make now a mobile game that costs either $1 or free,
Yeah.
I think you'll be very mistaken if you think you'll just translate one to one.
Yeah. It's especially in the console space, it's rarely a technical problem to switch into a very different genre, a very different kind of game. Um, we could do Forza Horizon in our engine. That wouldn't be a problem. That's not the problem. The problem is everything else. The tech is generally not the right. You can tell this, right? Because there are so many games that are built on Unreal, right? So
Yes.
clearly we can take one engine tech base and build a lot of different kinds of games with it. But that ends up not being the hard part.
No, it doesn't. So going back to the rapid fire questions, what's your favorite
Yep.
board game, movie, and video game?
Board game. Well, the board game that I've played the most is Scrabble. So I know that's not the answer most people would give you, but Scrabble is actually the actual answer. In terms of board games that people actually talk about, I tend to play a lot of two-player games with my wife. So, if those count, Lost Cities is one of our favorite games of all time. It's a Reiner Knizia game. It's a two-player. Um, it's game, super fun. It takes like 15 minutes. Great game. Everyone should play it. I'm going to count that as my answer: Scrabble and Lost Cities. Then movie. Oh wow, that's a hard one. I like the movie that. This is kind of embarrassing. I'm going to tell you anyhow. The movie that if I ever like flick past it on cable, I'll stop and watch to the end is Dodgeball. So I don't know why it has such a hold on my psyche, but I will always watch that movie till the end. And what was the last one?
Favorite video game?
Video game. Well, it was Skyrim, and then it was The Witcher 3, and then I actually sat and played Ghost. And this is the first time in my entire career is actually I crossed the Rubicon. I got to the point where my favorite game of all time was a game I worked on. It was Ghost of Tsushima. I just loved the game when I played it as a player. When I actually sat down and played it all the way through, because I've been working on it the whole time, right? I hadn't actually played it. The game was basically done and out in the field before I could sit down and play it, and I just loved it to death. I thought it was a great game. So now I'm to the point where that's my favorite video game of all time. So if I'm allowed to answer that, it's Ghost of Tsushima. If I'm not, then it's Witcher 3.
No, I mean, it's not like Sucker Punch games or bad games. They're amazing games. So it's definitely not a game that I feel like you're saying just because you made it. It is a good game. How does that feel to play your own game? Like, not just to play
Yeah,
for testing, but to sit there and play it to enjoy. Like,
it's different. It's one of the things that's actually Ghost was big enough that it felt fresh when I played it. A lot of the games we've made, by the time the game's out, I've actually played all the content, but there was so much content in Ghost that I hadn't played at all. So there were, like, I remember being on Ghost press tours and like doing interviews where someone would ask me about some part of the game. Like, I'm sorry, I haven't played that. Yeah, I know I built the game, I worked on it, but I haven't played that particular mission sequence. And so the questions they wanted to answer that I hadn't at that point I hadn't played. It wasn't until after the game had shipped and I could actually go through and platinum it.
what was their
That
reaction like to that? For the co-founder of Zuckerman to say that mission on the game that I've made, I don't know.
Oh, it wasn't a big deal. Like press for video games tends to be pretty friendly press, and
Yeah.
so if you're doing a stand up with someone and they ask you some question, you completely fumble the answer. There's no good comes of them sharing that. So that stuff just gets edited out. So it wasn't a big deal. That there's some particular mission sequence. It was the Moscow mission sequence. I played the first 3 missions like 80 times, but the last 2 I hadn't played just for reasons. Right, I ran out of time. I couldn't play them. There was nothing in him that needed my help, so I didn't play him. And so he had particular questions about some twists in that story that I didn't have answers to. It's like, I'm not even sure what you're talking about, actually. So it was funny. We laughed and moved on to other things. I did have the experience once where it more approximated that. So we made 3 Sly Cooper games, and then a couple years later, a company called Sunzaru Games made a Sly Cooper 4. And so I was able to play Sly Cooper 4, having talked to them a little bit about what was important about Sly, giving them some help very early on in the process. But I was completely fresh. I had no idea what was going to happen. I was playing it like any other consumer. And so I did have that experience once, and it was kind of fun. It was fun to see what someone else had done with our ideas, because it was absolutely a Sly Cooper game, but didn't really feel exactly like a Sly Cooper game that Sucker Punch had made. It felt almost exactly the same, but not quite. And so that was a really neat experience for me. They did a good job. It was a fun game to play. So I've had that experience once of kind of playing a Sucker Punch game that, as a customer would. But until Ghost, I'd really never had that pure experience of playing one of our games without really knowing everything that was going to happen before it happened.
Yeah, totally makes sense. So what's the video game that you're looking forward to?
The one we're working on. Gotta get it out.
You can, talk about, but also, another game, something that you're excited about.
Oh wow, I can tell you what's in my queues, because like I get I keep myself busy enough that it's hard. I'm sure everybody that's listening has a queue of video games that they want to play that they haven't played yet. So the one that I really would like to play, but I just need to get to the point where I actually have time to play it, is Baldur's Gate 3, which I really only played a little bit of. I know I'm going to like it, but it's the sort of game I can't play for a half hour at a time. And my life's been chopped up into half-hour bits lately. So in the winter, I'm on the panel that selects the finalists for the AIS awards. The awards get handed out at the DICE conference. And so in November, December, I'm required to play a lot of games. And so Baldur's Gate came out at a time when I was just had to dive into that queue. And then I just haven't been able to find, 20 hours free that I could actually really experience it. And I know I'm not going to finish in 20 hours. I know I've only scratched the surface at that point, but I haven't even gotten to that point yet. And so maybe this weekend I'm actually going to be able to dive in. We'll see how it all works out.
Okay, good stuff. And final question. It's a two-parter. Does money buy you happiness, and what does a good life mean to you?
No, well, that's a good question. I money cannot buy you happiness, but a lack of money can definitely buy you unhappiness. So I mean, we all have needs that have to be met, right? And if your needs aren't being met, if you don't have a place to sleep and food on the table, and be relatively confident that the same is going to be true in a week, it's very hard to be happy in those circumstances. But once you get past that, um, it money can help, but the academic work would say that it tops out pretty early. That after some point, if you're very poor, money can absolutely buy you happiness. But once you get to the point of being stable, more money doesn't generally buy you more happiness. What was the other question? There were two there. Oh, and what makes a full life?
Yeah, what does life mean?
I'm not sure I would trust my answer on this because I've been extraordinarily fortunate to have a lot of things in my life. And so I have a family I love, wife and daughters that are great. I have a fulfilling career, and I'm drowning in riches. I have so many things that have gone so well in my life that I can't even answer that question. Right? Life's great, and but so much has gone right. I don't know what part of it is actually the most important part. So I've had fulfilling work. That's clearly a big part of it. That I feel like I've been able to do things that have put smiles on people's faces. I find that really fulfilling. But I have a comfortable life and a family that loves me. So it's hard to discount that.
Okay, how about put it a different way? At the age that you're at now, looking
Yeah.
back, ignoring money and career slash, the products that you've made, what
Yeah.
things do you wish you had put more focus in or did now that you're looking back and you're like, I'm not 20 or 30 years old anymore. I wish I had maybe done a bit more of that or, focused a bit more on that area of my life.
That's a good question. At the margin, I probably would have spent just a little bit more time going and seeing my kids' extracurricular activities. I did go, but I think looking back, I probably could have gone to a few more softball games and plays than I did. So, yeah, but not big regrets, honestly. The, I don't know. I've been in a position where I was choosing between multiple good options, right? And so I think that big regrets tend to come when you're choosing between two options. One ends up being a bad option, and that's what you chose. And I haven't really chosen a lot of bad options, and I suspect it's because I was always in a situation between all the options where all the options were good. Because I don't think I'm that smart about figuring out how things are going to go. So I can't even look back and there are lots of things that I would do differently, but none where I'm like, yeah, that I would have been happier if I'd done that. So I don't know. I wish I had a better answer for you there, but some negative wisdom to hand down to the younger generation. But I couldn't tell you whether I just lucked out or whether I made good decisions.
I mean, probably a bit of both. I find it's usually a bit of both, but it's good to have
Yeah,
someone on the podcast that has had a meaningful and good life, and you're sitting there thinking,
yeah,
overall it's been good because ideally in a hopeful, idealistic world, that's how everyone's life should be.
yeah,
Bit
absolutely,
more
absolutely.
and everything should have been a matter of good or slightly better. Like,
Yeah. Well, I think especially in the age we live in, right, where I think that there are like, um, there's good in everyone's life, right? As I said, I've been blessed with having way more than my share of good things happen to me or for me or things that I've done. But there's good in everyone's life. I think the culture today, the world we live in, it makes it too easy. I think to compare the good things that have happened to you, the good things that have happened to someone else, and be envious, right? Like it's a the internet is a culture of envy, right? I think for some people, I've been able to resist the siren call of thinking, oh well, if we'd done this, things could have happened even better than they did, right? But I definitely feel the pull, like everybody does. I think to see, um, how things worked out for everybody else, right? I mean, it's like it could have things been different, better. I don't know. I not in any important way, I don't think, but in unimportant ways, sure. So
I just want to thank you, Chris, for coming on to FireDEV today. I know I loved that conversation, and I'm sure the audience will love the conversation as well. So thank you, Chris.
thank you, Fran. It was fun.
And I want to thank everyone for listening to this episode of FireDev with Chris Zimmerman of Sucker Punch. And I'll see all of you. Actually, before I forget, again, low reminder of the competition that we're running of Chris's book. So again, to enter, all you got to do, give the podcast a rating on the platform of your choice and just comment with your favorite Sucker Punch game as well. That's all you have to do. And again, if you don't win, please do buy the book because the proceeds do go to Girls Who Code as well, a great organization. So thank you, Chris. Thank you everyone for listening, and I'll see you all in next week's episode. Bye bye.